how's it going, man?
Doing mostly great. How are you?
I'm doing good, man. I dude, I always love these conversations because I always learn a ton, right? Like I'm always walking away going, yeah, I didn't know that before. So I'm looking forward to this discussion too. So, but before we start, we have to do the obligatory what you're working on because it's always fascinating.
Right. Well, that might take the entire podcast, so I'll try and be fast on that.
It's okay. It's okay.
Um,
It's okay.
the so I've got a hard commitment to a few projects that I'll kind of skim over for because I think most people are kind of aware. My high priority is getting DNC annotated done because I did a fundraiser. I've got a commitment to get that done within a certain deadline. I'm trying to get through. And so DNC 132 annotated is hot on my list. And for people who aren't familiar with my annotated version, that's not me commenting and doing a bunch of research and arguing and so forth. That's me finding the early brethren talking about DNC 132 and how they interpreted it, or hopefully more preferably how they said Joseph said thus and such about it, and that sort of thing. So that's a big project I'm still working on, and the complete teachings of Joseph Smith is still there. I haven't been hitting that hard lately for reasons we might chat about later. Those are the two big things. But that said, I've got three other books that are kind of sitting on the doorstep. I'm about 80% through, and um, a book I'm calling Essential Adam-God Teachings, which is kind of what some people have described to me as Adam-God for Dummies. I prefer to think of it as Adam-God for the brand new initiate and or Adam-God for teenage fundamentalists. Just really hitting the basics. At the same time, I'm kind of about 80, 70% through, somewhere around there. Another volume I'm calling Exploring Adam-God Teachings, and that's where I'm taking all of kind of the deeper materials in Adam-God Teachings and everything that I've heard over the last 30, 35 years. I've been researching it. No, it's not, sorry, 20, 25 years. Did it in 2005. So that's 21 plus 4, 25 years. Um, Whether I believe it or not, basically investigating some of those claims. If I can definitively prove those are false from a very clear statement from the brethren at that time, then I don't address them. But if there's any room for, well, maybe, then I kind of explore that. So for those who don't like speculation, they want hard doctrine, that's not going to be the right book for them. But for those who just kind of get excited trying to understand what are further implications or ramifications of the doctrine and why does it matter and why is it such a big deal and why do people get controversial over it, those people should really enjoy that. And lastly, one that I've surprisingly had a lot of people asking for me to produce and hurry up on is one on Mormon reincarnation and the 19th century Mormon thought. And I've pretty much finished the beginning of that. It's about 150 pages right now. I've done 5 or 6 personal podcasts on it. I've got at least one or two more left, where I kind of go over the discourses and then talk a little bit about some details that a lot of people miss or haven't discussed before. And the real thrust of that I think is most important for most listeners is I and my subtitle is to be determined, but I really want to say, what did the early brethren really teach? Because
Okay.
there's a lot of crap out there and people saying, well, this is what it means. But that's precisely what the early brethren, all of them, said was false.
Right.
So why do people still believe it? There are reasons for that, and arguably decent reasons. But I like to explore what was actually taught, what was clearly taught versus what speculation and what is commonly believed to say, well, this is what it meant, which was precisely what Joseph, Brigham, Wolfowitz, and I believe John Taylor as well, all said that's manifestly false. So
Gotcha.
that's a working project. I mean, originally I wanted to call it Forgotten Mormon Teachings and have it be about 500 pages long, easy, maybe 6 or 7, because it goes into progression between kingdoms, dissolution, sons of perdition, how that process works, second death, all these types of things, as well as progression of like after exaltation, what's our progression look like, and exploring some of those quotes, which are also quite controversial, but regardless, we have them. It's good to have the resource available. So that's all part of that project. And I'm also
Man,
working.
oh, never mind. I was going to say, man, that's a lot, but keep going, please.
I'll skip some of them because honestly, there's some that are further on the back burner. But I've also had quite a strong interest from Centennial Parkers and people here locally to put together a volume that's basically combining Joseph W. Musser's Book of Remembrance with items of the Book of Remembrance with School of the Prophets, as well as I've had a small team of people typing up for me um, the letters that I have between Joseph Musser and Rulin, Joseph Musser and President Smith, Joseph Musser and various early people in the early movement of the Woolyites that a lot of people don't really even know who they are anymore, unless you're part of the branch that still reveres them. But I've got a couple hundred unpublished letters, mostly with Musser and other people. Some of them are just between Rulin and other people as well. But anyway, a whole treasure trove of information there. And I've been thinking about putting it into one volume, all those sources, so you could cross-reference them and have an index and all that sort of stuff. Uh, I don't know what to call it. Woollyite encyclopedia, maybe something like that. um, but at any rate, that's also in the works. So
Gotcha.
those are kind of the major
Whew,
things.
that's a lot. Dude, does AI help you at all in any of this?
I wish I could say yes, but I'm on the very, very verge of that. So I'm hoping to experience that soon. I started back for anybody who remembers, you remember Gospel Inc. and Infobase?
Oh,
Um,
yes.
Man, Infobase was so good. It basically functioned as a database. You just convert your Word document into a section of it. Boom, it's part of a database. You could search it by topic, you could search part of a discourse. You could break it up so that literally you could break up every discourse in the Journal of Discourse, and it would search each one separately. This is back before that was really available online and that sort of stuff. But anyway, they did a fabulous job, and then the church took over and they bought them out. Didn't pay them well, from what I've heard, and then they turned it into Gospel Inc. And so I went and I purchased the first version of Gospel Inc. And I said, look, I don't mean to be obstinate, but before I fork out $150 or whatever this thing is, I want to know, can I say I do not want a response from this blankety blank computer that is post 1918? Can I
Mm,
say I don't want anything after that? I'm a historian. I only want before that day or 1919, whatever. And I only want Joseph Smith. Will it do that for me? Oh, yes. And they called up corporate. Absolutely, we'll do that. But what they didn't tell me, and I ended up returning it because, like all the church stuff, they're pushing other things other than what you really might want. So they did
mm,
the like publisher. So if Deseret Book published, Journal of Discourses, they also get a push. Bruce R. McConkie and Peterson and
mm,
anything that's modern. And I'm like, I don't want to sort through all that crap. I don't have all the time to deal with all that garbage. For me, it's garbage. It's just, if I'm looking at 1800s, what Bruce R. McConkie said is not going to help me. So I'm not saying what he spoke was garbage. I'm saying it's for my project, for my research. It's not helpful. It's a complete waste of my time. It's garbage for me. As a historian, not as an individual. So anyway, just to be clear, I don't want to offend anybody. But so I quit looking through that. So I started developing my own database years ago and converting everything into
mm,
Scrivener, which is kind of like Infobase, but it's made by an independent source and it's made for authors and it has all these powerful things that I use, but I still can't convert everything into it and I still need a little bit of help. So I got a call recently. This is all answering your question. So I've been working on converting everything into a searchable database literally for like 15 years. And I actually traded my physical copy of Journal of Discourses for Justin Franken, who you know, to convert that in. He just did a program and converted it into discourses and put it on my Scrivener file so I could search that independently and anyway, there's all sorts of cool stuff you can do with Scrivener that allowed me to do that. But I still have had limitations. One is, for example, if I put my entire database of early Mormon journals in there, there used to be a whole bunch more of that online, which Kevin Kraut has backed up, so you can still get a lot of that online. I don't know the URL, so I can't tell the listener, but you can find it if you look it up. At any rate, if I were to put that entire database on Scrivener, that's all nice, but the people who typed it up might put J bracket O S bracket dot Smith or something like that, or any 100 variations of that. So in order to say, what did Joseph Smith teach? I literally have to type in about 20 different searches for J.S, J.O.S, J.O space dot S M, or all these different things with brackets. It's just obnoxious and it takes forever. So I've really just not done it. But I was approached recently by a friend and he said, hey, my son has been working with several different AI and has developed a program that will search everything for you. So you can literally say, and I'm going to get more information on this on Saturday, but I can literally say, what did Joseph Smith teach that's found in the Millennial Star? And it will find every instance where it's Joseph Smith speaking in the Millennial Star for me, which will speed up, by his estimates, at least 50 times my research, which means a project that I literally thought was going to take me a year will probably take me about a month and a half, 2 months, because even though it compiles everything for me, still have to sort it through. I still have to contextualize it, still have to organize it by date. I still have to, which maybe it'll do that for me too. I don't know. We'll see what I can pull off. But even with all that, I still have to do tags like I did in Forgotten Mormon Teachings, where I know people who study a certain topic might read into it something that's not explicit. For instance, there are places in Forgotten Mormon Teachings, I know people use that particular quote from Joseph to support blood atonement or to support multiple probations or whatever. So I put little tags on there, so when I do the index, it'll pull those discourses up for somebody searching those particular topics. So I'll still have to do a bunch of that, but feasibly, I could find a boatload more information that's ever been available for. And through some friends and through this database, I also have a boatload of information on Woolley, John Woolley, Lawrence C. Woolley, that's never been published, that I could feasibly put all in one resource and then be ready to do a biography on those brethren, and or at least a resource for people who want to know more about them, and just have those sources there. So I'm super excited about the possibility. This will help me do complete teachings of Joseph Smith way faster. I literally thought I'm going to have to do a fundraiser and get a year's worth of income set aside to pull that off, because it's a lot of
Yeah.
reading. I mean, imagine going through all the minute meetings and all of the council meetings and all of the periodicals, speed reading even, and knowing who wrote what, trying to figure out where's the teaching of Joseph in here. It's an enormous job, and
Oh,
one that I
yeah.
think is overdue and needs to be done, but hasn't ever been done. And frankly, if somebody else did it, I still wouldn't trust it, because I see too much cherry picking and, oh, this isn't reliable. Joseph didn't really teach that. He wouldn't have said that, so it must be a bad source. And those who know what I do, I don't do that. I'm not the arbiter of truth, so I will leave all those in and let the reader decide. But anyway, I'm hoping that whatever that is, that artificial intelligence program he's got, will speed up what I'm doing. And he knows what I do and specifically wants to work with me to produce something that might be available to everybody at a future point in time, but I'll be kind of the beta tester. At least that's my current understanding. Until Saturday, I don't know for sure. But what I do know is it's the hope is for it to be available to the public. I've had two or three other um, opportunities that people have talked to me about doing something like this, and they've never followed up with it.
Mm.
This is pretty much done. It just needs to go through beta, and it needs a database, and I've got that database. And he's got resources I don't have, so that's that. If I could plug the audience here, I used to have access to all of Millennial Star, the first 40 volumes. And when I say all, that's all I really mean. I recognize it kept going after that, but that's about the time period where church doctrine starts changing a lot, and I don't really study that era much. So I only have like the first four, six, maybe nine, I don't know, but it's not everything. And it used to be digitally available, Millennial Star, in PDF and or doc or text or something. I don't remember. I know it was on Infobase um, uh, before it was taken over by the church. After the church took over, there were only like 4 or 9 available volumes after that point. If anybody has that, I would, if I was a rich man, I would give you a lot of money. But since I'm a super poor man, I, I would give you the greatest blessings I could invoke upon you. That's about all I can promise. But I would love to have that resource. I've got, maybe think like times and seasons. I've got all of those digitally available. I've got a massive database of Deseret news in PDF form that I don't have digitally, but that would be a great resource to put in this as well, because it could sort things through really, really quickly. What did Brigham Young ever say on blood atonement that was published in the Deseret News? Poof, 5 minutes later, you got a list. That'd just be awesome.
Yeah, it would.
So
If someone has that, Drew, how do you want them to reach out to you?
Drew Briney at gmail.com.
Okay,
That's
perfect.
that's easy. I mean, if I don't want to throw my phone number out,
No,
uh,
don't do that.
but
Yes, don't,
because I
don't,
already get,
don't do that.
honestly, I don't answer my phone anyway because I get too much spam. Um, but if somebody approaches me via email and we need to chat, I'm more than happy to talk to them. But I already don't answer my phone. It's a thing. If you're rich, it's maybe not a thing, but if you're poor like me, then everybody knows you get creditors calling and spam people, and you know, yeah, no
Uh,
thanks.
I just imagine Drew's voicemail being like, if your income is from here to here, press one and I'll answer
That's
your call.
right.
If not, hang up.
If you're a potential sponsor,
Right.
please continue to hold.
Check, check. Well,
Oh,
dude,
speaking of, sorry,
yeah,
you asked about projects. I've had a
yeah,
lot of people talking to me about two different things that I should probably mention here. One is I've got a lot of people asking about doing a JST with the RV.
okay.
And the answer is as soon as we have funds to do that, we're happy to do that. We've talked about various means of trying to fund it. Maybe we need to do a Patreon or something. I don't know. But at this point, we don't have the funds for it, but we've already started working on it. And the second thing along those lines, shoot. I've had a couple groups approach us and say, hey, we'd like to have an RV. Could you take out DNC sections, blah, 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 that are Joseph's and install our profits, stuff like that. That we've had some talk about doing something like that. If they were interested to get bulk discounts, they'd have to order maybe, I don't know, 600 or 1,000 copies or something. That's something for the team, not for me to decide. And prepay that so that we can pay the printer and make it happen. But I would also get paid some of that to actually format and rechange and do all the stuff that they want. And our publisher would also get paid some of that to do his job. But the remaining part, we've had discussions. So it may not happen this way, but I've had discussions about funding the JST that way, like taking all the
Gotcha.
profits that way and whatever those are and putting them toward the JST. So if anybody's interested in those types of things, or they're great at fundraising and know the right people, those are also some projects that we're working on. That's not me personally per se. It kind of feels very personal since I'm the one doing the the
Well,
actual text, but it's not me personally that's producing those. So we've got a team of people that are doing stuff I can't do.
I was going to say, of course it feels personal to you. You'll be the one with carpal tunnel. Um,
Right.
that I am totally down for a JST. Now, just out of curiosity, how would it be different than say what's produced by like the Community of Christ or something like that? Will there be references back to the Book of Mormon in there, something like that? I mean, how would it differ the community of Christ puts forward?
Right. Good question. First of all, the main thing is what I've already been doing. There are 3,410 verses changed by Joseph Smith.
Hmm.
Um, you can read the Church of Christ version and never know what those verses are. So
Right.
I will be italicizing every change. I've already underlined them in my personal scriptures, and I've had those for like 20 years. I finished that at 22 years old or something like that. So I can already just open it up, see if it's changed or not. But that will be available for everybody to see. So that's one change. Two is yes, cross-referencing to the Book of Mormon, where things were changed in the Book of Mormon that were not changed in the JST or that were changed differently. So there's that. I think more significantly work-wise for me is if I'm going to do it, I want to do it right, which means that Joseph brought up the different translations for the Bible in about 30 or 40 discourses or on 30, 40 occasions in some personal journals and meeting minutes, stuff like that. And I would include all of those at least in the footnotes as well and say Joseph suggested this should have read like this. Now, there are some places where he had interpretations, or well, the Angel Moroni quoted the same verse like four different ways. So all those would be included as well. And so
Interesting.
that's how it would be different than theirs. As well as I'd probably have original King James versus JST um, numberings and so forth for Genesis and places like that, where people might not know. A lot of people will go look at the JST and they think, oh, the Bible verses suffice, and they can't find it. So it would have
Right.
both when necessary. And also, um, I want to do, and I don't know if this will ever happen because I'm not a huge. This was my life's dream, was to create a JST for like 10 years, and now I don't care as much for technical reasons. But if I personally like to do a different version, and that version is only the changes made in the JST and in discourses being published separately. And a lot
Okay.
of people instantly say, "Oh, that was already done. Brother so and so did that. It's Red Book. I remember it." And that is the crappiest piece of scholarship that's ever been done, and it's useless. And the
But
reason
other than
is,
that, a fine piece of literature.
other than that, it's so helpful. I, I I got so mad I almost wanted to burn my copy when I found out what they'd done. They used the British King James version, and Joseph used an American King James version. So every time the spelling was different, Savior is Savior in the British version, they counted that as a change that Joseph Smith made. So in the parallel columns edition, you literally have thousands of verses side by side saying this is what Joseph changed. And if you look, the only thing you will find is favor or savor or something is spelled differently, Savour instead of Savor. And that's I mean, that defeats the whole purpose of the book.
Yep.
I feel like you got to cross out the 3,000 verses that has spelling error and then only use the other ones. And that is just garbage to me. It's
Yeah.
so frustrating. And nobody's ever done a good job on it.
Well, and
So
if it's spelling changes, I mean that to me is kind of silly, right? I mean, look,
yeah, well, he didn't make those changes. That's because they were
right.
using a different version of the Bible.
Yes.
I mean, so it's anyway, yeah.
Okay, so
So
here's my $1 million question with with doing a JST. Is Drew Briney the man that has an extreme amount of love for the King James version of English? Are you
right,
going to be able to
yes.
get through that, Drew? Are you going to be able to not have your heart broken every time you have to add in thee or thus or
Right.
any of the other language that goes along with the King James version?
So that is precisely why I don't want the entire thing. I just want the changed things. But I already created the text and did the versification and formatting, all of that a couple decades ago, like a long, long time ago. But I've never published it because I still have to mark the 3,410 verses, right? And when I'm done with that, I still have these other things. I have been collecting in the back ends of my books for all of that time since I went on a mission like 30 years ago. Um, Page thus and so, or in the margins, I'll just have to flip through where it says JST on it. And then I could go through the Journal of Abraham Canon, for instance, and said Joseph told us this was a better interpretation of this verse. So that would be a footnote that, it's a hearsay account, so it's a footnote as opposed to changing the text. But it's going to say, George Q. Cannon told us on Abraham H. Cannon that Joseph interpreted this verse to use this word instead of this word, and blah, there it is. So it would have all of those too, which nobody else has done, and I don't blame them. What a horrible, nitpicky thing to have to research. But at the end of the day, I would love to have the volume, and it's one of those things that I know the instant it gets published, you've got it in your hands, and you're like, hooray! Then somebody says, "Hey, how come you didn't include this quote from the Journal of Mosiah Hancock? He said thus and so," and you look at it and you're like, "Oh man, that's a great resource," and I missed it. That's going to happen. Those things are going to happen, and you got to hate it. But at any rate, at least something's there that you can put in the margin. Mosiah Hancock, you know, type up an insert
Right.
and get it ready for the next edition.
You know, the the RV that you produced was just spectacular, right? I'm a
Oh, good.
big fan of that. And I can't encourage everyone enough to go get a copy because look, the 125 revelations are in the back, that's worth it alone, right? Whatever you're going to pay for it. Um,
Yeah.
and I just can't encourage everybody enough to go get that. So if you're okay, because we're kind of freewheeling here, I don't
Yeah.
want to I don't want to go into it a lot because I imagine when you do drop the annotated version of 132, I'd love to have you back on just for that. But there is a question, and look, I ain't me if I ain't breaking something and, asking the tough question. I do
Right.
have a question about 132 if you're down.
Sure. I'll
Okay.
promise at least a false doctrine answer.
Perfect. Perfect.
Best
So
case
we're
scenario will give you good doctrine.
right. I like it. So it's verse 51. And it says, "Verily I say unto you, a commandment I give unto mine handmaiden Emma Smith, your wife, whom I have given unto you, that she stay herself and partake not of that which I commanded you to offer her. For I did it, saith the Lord, to prove you all, as I did Abraham, that I might require an offering at your hand by covenant and sacrifice."
Right.
So I did the dumb thing once early on in my career as a Mormon when I was still in the LDS church. And
To look that up.
and I asked the gospel doctrine teacher, I'm like, what was it that was offered to her? And he's like, we're not, and I knew it was bad, right? In that moment, I was like,
Mhm.
oh, that's not one I should have answered because every head, I sit in the back, right? Because
Yeah,
that's just where I belong, right? Just
right.
sit in the back. And
With a brown
I
book
asked,
cover around whatever book you're really reading.
right, exactly. Exactly. Look, it could be the Doctrine and Covenants, or it could be this year's football stats. You don't know.
Right.
That's why that
I
covers hair.
I've known
Anyway,
people that put brown paperback book cover over Adam-God teachings and read that during the church. They didn't want people to know what they were reading. So
Drew, your books are like, well, they're kind of like illicit drugs, right? Like if you're in the LDS church, I just imagine there's some dude with a trench coat in the back alley of Salt Lake City somewhere going, "You need a fix." And then he just opens that coat and there's like Adam-God teachings, all the rest of your work just right there, like which one you want.
right.
But
How deep do you want to go?
you're right, exactly. But anyway, so here's a question. What was the offer? Do we know for certain, or is this still in the realm of speculation?
I think we've got a pretty darn good idea.
Okay.
And I say that thinking as a historian, I'm convinced that we know, um, but it's extremely controversial. So we have journals of William Clayton that talk about this. I believe it is Lorenzo Snow's personal journal that talks about this. And I do have footnotes for this in DNC annotated. I haven't gotten to that spot. I don't know that I'll put a lot there because they're technically not interpreting that verse. They're just saying what the history was. So I haven't decided how exactly I'm going to approach this because it's so controversial. But those journal entries say that Emma pestered Joseph Smith so much about plural marriage that he finally agreed to tell her, and apparently after being offered through prayer through the Father, that she could have a husband in exchange for not bothering him about plural marriage anymore.
Mm.
And the speculation is that she chose William Clayton. And Joseph actually went to William Clayton at one point and said, "Have you been familiar with Emma? You guys are talking too much." That's not his exact words, but that's the gist of it. And Clayton, in his journal, said his feelings were hurt and he's upset about it and straightened things out with Joseph and hadn't done anything wrong, that sort of stuff. Um, but that's what the offer was. And when he's telling, and it's really, really interesting from that perspective, because if you go back, and that's the short answer, right? There's this journal suggests yes, and these people think he's lying because they're polygamy deniers, whatever. I mean, you've got all that sort of stuff that's available there. If you just look at the text that say this is what the verse is, and it's the brethren, and they're talking about that verse, namely the history of that verse, that's the gist of what we have. So, but I think it's really, really interesting that, in that verse, Heavenly Father says, "I was just testing you. That's not a real thing, and we're not going to do that." Because at the beginning, toward the beginning of D&C 132, he says, "You've asked me concerning adultery." And so here's my answer. If a woman has been appointed to have another husband by the one with the keys, she's already sealed with another, but she's been appointed, it's not adultery, right? So he's pointing out precisely the polyandry stuff that he's been involved in, but he's also pointing out precisely his test with Emma. But he doesn't say, "But you don't have to do that personally. That was just a test there." He just lets it aside. So he gives this whole long revelation through Joseph. And Joseph, and this is me uh, not speculating. This is me kind of imagining what it must have been like for Joseph receiving this revelation. He's listening and thinking, I really didn't like this thing, and you told me to do it, and now you tell me it's okay because I appointed it. But if I hadn't appointed it, it wouldn't be okay. So I think that was what must have been going through his head at the time. And then he goes on to talk about the Abrahamic test. And Joseph had talked to John Taylor on at least 4 occasions and said, if God could have tested Abraham more, he would have. He will test us to the extremes. That's, Lectures on Faith 6, where he says Christ was tested further than any other man could be tested. And so, we have these principles he's talking about here, basically really pushing Joseph further and further. It's not to the very end of the revelation. He says, "Oh, by the way, I made you ask all the apostles for their wives, and that was their test, but this was yours." And by the way, so
Interesting.
meanwhile, Emma Smith went to I don't want to say the name wrong, but William Law in the streets, and she was really ticked about the revelation. She said, "I was told in Revelation I'd be destroyed if I didn't accept it." And but she's really, really pissed about it. And she really lets William Law get an earful, and he records that, of course, because they were kindred spirits about opposing plural marriage. So anyway, that's the answer to the question, and it's a really controversial thing. I know people get really upset about it, and you can just blow it off and say it was just a test, or you can look at it and say, but he did live polyandry also, and the angel came with a sword drawn after he'd been living polyandry, saying it wasn't good enough. And there are all sorts of really interesting details to discuss there. But anyway, that's the quote unquote short answer to your question. I'm happy to answer
Gotcha.
follow, but I also know it's super controversial. You might be like, "Oh, let's dodge any more of that." So
We're just gonna plow through. So it is interesting because I did pick that up, right? That the angel with the sword doesn't show up until after he's done the polyandrous sealings.
yeah, like 9 of them.
And it leads me to believe, and this look, shoot this down if I'm wrong. I'm used to being wrong here. It makes me wonder. if those polyandrous sealings, because he seems to be very particular in who he offers this to as well, right?
Mhm.
If there isn't, if he's not trying to like skirt around actual plural marriage as we would understand it today, right?
Yeah,
And I wonder if that's not what he was trying to do, right? Like, ugh, I really don't want to
yeah,
do this. Is there can can I find a loophole? Is
yeah.
kind of what he's aiming at. I
There
don't know
seems
if
to be
that bears weight
indication
at
of that.
all. What's that?
Yeah, yeah. I've heard that there seems to be an indication for that. Um, and I think Quinn has done some really good research about sexual polyandry and that these were not innocuous marriages. I have not reviewed that in context of this particular question of did that activity happen after the angel came, but not before? And was he really just saying, okay, your husband's a loser. He's not going to make celestial kingdom. Stay married to him. I'll be married to you for eternity. And good enough. Hooray. I kept the commandment. Move on. I haven't researched that personally to see was that the case. I know there's been a lot of speculation in various articles that appears to be what he was doing. And from a believer's perspective, that's why the angel came and said, look, not good enough. You were told to do it this other way. You're cheating here. Not good enough. Get it together or you're going to get in trouble. That would suggest he wasn't having sexual relationships with him from a certain point of view. I should say it like this, that could suggest. It
Right.
doesn't necessarily suggest, but it could suggest that. And it can be read that way. And I know a lot of people have read it that way. I've not researched to see if that's in fact accurate. Up until that point, did he forbear from relations until the angel came? But I think that's an interesting. I'd love it if anybody knows that. Put it in the comments, email me, and let me know. I honestly don't keep up with a lot of stuff like that because there's so much bad research these days, and I'm already stretched 100 different directions that I don't hit a lot of that. That said, I probably will only drop a footnote, but I think it's very significant that the uh, linguistic print, I don't remember what they call it, but the computer analysis of the voice of Joseph Smith was, I think, definitively determined that this was written by Joseph. Um, when they compare his voice print in Revelations versus in person versus Brigham Young versus anybody else, it's just too far away from anybody else to have been anybody but Joseph that voiced that revelation.
Wow.
Um, so I think that's very, very significant from a polygamy denier perspective. Although they, not long after that study was done, they interviewed somebody or posted an article, paper, some I wasn't there. I just heard secondhand of some. I don't mean this disrespectfully, but some kid, mid 20s or something, who did not do a computer study, but said, "I've read this and compared carefully Joseph's verbiage, and I don't think this is Joseph." Um, so I didn't ever bother to read or study what he had to say because to me, I kind of like Brigham Young. I don't give a straw for any man's opinion. The computer will put out what it puts out, and it's, in my estimation, been proven to be accurate in the past and is used in many professions to do voice prints for various reasons. And if that objective analysis is wrong, uh, I want to see some pretty intense credentials in a 100-page paper pointing out why it's wrong and why somebody's personal analysis should be trusted instead. It just
Sure.
doesn't doesn't make any sense to me to trust. I don't care if it's Michael Quinn, who I have great admiration for as a historian, despite some of his cheating from time to time on footnotes and so forth. But uh, as much as I admire him, if he said that, I'd be kind of like, the computer
Right.
did this voice print that they've got 3D models from, and they've compared all these different, I mean, it's this more advanced technology they've been using for decades now. It's probably
Yeah.
admissible in court. To dismiss it casually because I think so just isn't good enough for me.
Sure. Absolutely. Um, we're gonna dive into those two Adam-God books. Those are the ones I got questions on. But before
Okay.
we go there, if you're comfortable answering this, um, Jacob Vadrine recently put out some new stuff on Adam-God, some new videos. Have you looked into those? Is like what are we to take away from some of those things? Or he'd posted that it was new evidence. What is
Yeah.
that new evidence?
Okay. So um let me first off say I appreciate a lot what Vitrine is
Mhm.
doing. I've
Yep.
deliberately not watched those because
Okay.
I'm doing my own analysis of it and I don't want
Okay.
to cross infect.
Yep.
And I don't mean that in a rude way. I'm just like I
Yeah.
don't want to take what he's doing and copy, and I don't want to dispute anything either. At least not until I've done my initial analysis. So when I first heard about this, I've got a few friends that toss me anything and everything that has to do with plural marriage into my inbox, um, and that's not my main area of study, but occasionally they throw other stuff at me too, and two of them sent me this thing of new evidence of Adam-God teachings. So I thought, well, that's really interesting, but shoot, I had it my table of contents off to the side accidentally, but my computer lost it. So sorry for getting distracted for a
No,
minute.
you're good.
Um, so anyway, I initially just started reading over those minutes, and I was like, oh, I've already read this. I know what this is. This is in my book. This is how it is. People say, oh, I discovered some new Adam God thing, but it's in my book from like 20 years ago, And and I get those fairly regularly. So I blew it off. And um, I thought, well, I'll look at it more carefully later. But I asked a question to my friend, and he said, "Oh, well, they're saying thus and so." And I said, "Okay." So I looked more carefully instead of just reading the minutes. I actually looked into it like I should have the first time. I was just skimming it. I didn't look at it as, oh, this is really important. But when I did, this is what I found out. So, in understanding Adam-God teachings, there are minute meetings from these Orson Pratt trial meeting. Um, there are minutes of that meeting, and they're in understanding Adam-God teachings. However, there's a different account of those same minute meetings that never saw the light of day until a couple of weeks ago. That's
Okay.
what Vidrine's talking about. They're legitimate minutes. And I skimmed over them, read them, and I'm like, yeah, remember this, remember this, remember this, remember this. And in skimming, didn't see a whole lot that was new. But boy, when you look deeper, there's some really heavy stuff. I've done two podcasts on this, so about 2 hours worth. I've got another half-hour podcast to finish up on it. And there at least two really big, huge, notable things in it, but lots of extra stuff that is really interesting. So here are the two notable things. One, Orson Pratt was, and everybody knows this. I'm giving context. Orson Pratt was under fire for refuting Adam-God teachings and publishing against them and teaching against them, and he was legitimately looking at a possibility of being excommunicated. These minutes acknowledge that he says, I recognize I might get disfellowshipped for this. He was going to lose a seat in the quorum. And I've seen other evidence that he was going to get X'd. It's been a long time since I've looked at that, so I can't definitively say that was on the table. What I do know is Brigham Young said, I'm not seeing him get out of the quorum again. I'll whip him right, I'll wrestle him down and whip his ears or whatever metaphor he uses. But he says, I want Orson to repent and get this fixed. So what's new about these minute meetings? One, Brigham Young definitively, well, Orson Pratt says, I don't believe in Brigham's teachings because I follow Joseph. This is what Joseph taught. And he does the standard,
Mhm.
Jesus is Jehovah type concepts. It doesn't say that specific thing, but that's the concept. And that's the idea. Jesus was the first fruits of the resurrection. So Adam couldn't have been resurrected. And if he's a spirit, he couldn't have fathered Jesus, and blah, blah, blah. So he makes all this argument, and Brigham gets up, and this is what's new. And he gets upset. You can tell he's upset at Orson about this. He said, that's Joseph's doctrine. Heber C. Kimball was present, and Willard Richards was present when Joseph taught these doctrines. And they're here right now today and can basically, I mean, there's sketchy. The minutes are incomplete. They're kind of sketchy. They're not complete, is what I mean. Not they're not trustworthy. They're just not. They're incomplete, and incomplete sentences a lot and that sort of stuff. It appears that he's saying these two brethren are here. Is this or is this not Joseph's teaching? And apparently they confirm it. And then he says further, this is number two thing that's really cool that I'm kind of pissed about. He says, um, after this, I received revelation about Adam-God teaching at Luke Johnson's home. And the spirit overcame us like an earthquake, and people in the entire neighborhood felt the spirit and felt the quaking of the earth trembling or something. It's a little bit vague how he describes it, but it sounds like there's a little rumbling of the earth around
Mm.
Luke Johnson's house, and all the people in the neighborhood, which I believe was by the John Johnson farm, which is a little ways away from the rest of the saints. I think it's about 5-10 miles. It's been a long time since I've been there. But at any rate, he was describing the whole neighborhood felt the spirit and was aware of this revelation. And he said, George Albert Smith and Wilford Woodruff, who were here when I received that revelation. And it looks like he calls for them to testify as well. I mean, it's just a little bit sketchy, but they're present and he's saying this. So he's called now upon 4 people. The Adam-God teachings are a revelation, not just a teaching. 2 of those are there to testify that Joseph taught it, not Brigham. And 2 are there to testify that they were there when Brigham Young had this revelation, and the whole neighborhood felt the earthquake because the spirit was so strong when he received this revelation. And he also says Joseph knew he couldn't teach this teaching to all the saints because they weren't willing to receive the teachings he was giving them. And he adds this, which I think is also a third item if you want. He says Joseph's taught over 100 times that he wanted to teach the saints more, but they weren't ready and they would not receive what he had to teach. Now, that kind of ticked
Interesting.
me off for 2 reasons. In the RV, I include every known revelation of the prophets who say, here either is the revelation or I received a revelation. Here's the substance of the revelation, and we don't have a word for word or whatever. I would have included that in the RV because he claims I received this revelation and this is what it said. We don't have the exact word for word text, but he does say this is what it taught. And number 2, I have a compilation in the RV of places where Joseph Smith said, I want to teach this people more, but they're not willing to receive it. And here's Brigham Young saying, he said over 100 times, I mean, hyperbole, maybe. I've got like 40 quotes, so I don't think this is hyperbole. But he says over 100 times, Joseph taught he wanted to teach more, but the saints wouldn't let him because they weren't ready.
Interesting.
So that's hugely significant. Um,
Well, yeah,
again,
because we hear that a lot, right? That is something that I think we're all used, even if you're in the LDS church, you're used to that quote, right? That there's more that I would have given this people, but how'd he put it? It's
yeah,
like trying to split
I would,
wood with a corn dodger and something else,
yeah,
right? Or
yeah, yeah.
they fly apart like glass. And it's interesting if we can put that into the Nauvoo period, and then we now have Brigham saying, "Yeah, he'd have taught him this, but they just wouldn't accept it." Right? All
Yeah.
and he said it 100 times. That puts some pretty stark context around that.
Yes, exactly. And I have been a firm adherent, and I usually mention this when people are like, what are your biases? Brigham Young said, I've never taught anything but that Joseph taught it to me. Now, some people say, well, Brigham, he invented polygamy and he invented Adam-God, he invented blood atonement, he invented the black and priesthood ban, all this sort of stuff. Um, I can see that skeptical perspective. I understand that skeptical perspective. I believe Brigham when he said that. The more I have studied and thought, oh, this doesn't really seem to have come from Joseph Smith, dissolution down to native intelligence or whatever. The next thing I know, and this, next thing I know only comes from a 50 plus year old who's thinking like this. But 5-10 years later, next thing you know, I find a quote from Joseph that somebody said in a journal, this is what Joseph taught. And there's that teaching of Brigham's that I thought I couldn't find anything before on. I consistently, over my years of study, have found Joseph's teaching whatever Brigham said, I can find a quote for it, and or somebody saying, "Yeah, he told me this thing." And and occasionally, or not infrequently, you'll see scholars say, "Well, so and so claimed this, but we don't have any other record of it, and they're full of it, and whatever," and they just poo-poo those. But I've seen so many of those over the years, or over things I thought, well, maybe Brigham did make up this detail or something. And then boom, there you have it. He says, no, Joseph, or somebody says Joseph taught it. So uh, I believe him when he said that. Did he misunderstand some stuff Joseph taught? Well, you can argue that, and I think that's an interesting philosophical debate. But I personally I find evidence that every time he says Joseph taught me, that's what Joseph taught. Somebody else said so too. It wasn't just Brigham. So, for those who want to believe he was a political manipulator and convinced people to lie and create false affidavits to preach what he wanted to, you know, you're never going to convince those people anyway. So when I say what's my bias is I believe Brigham when he said that. I think when he said
Hmm.
Joseph, I don't teach anything but that Joseph taught me. I think he meant it. Now, philosophically speaking, if Joseph said, in a lot of Latter Day Saints miss this, but Joseph Smith said Adam is the Ancient of Days. Well, to any Protestant in Joseph Smith's day who knew their
Hmm.
doctrine, he just said Adam is God.
Hmm.
If you talk to a Protestant today and you say, "Who's the Ancient of Days?" and Daniel, they're going to say it's God the Father. It's God. That's obvious. Everybody knows this. It's not even debated. I honestly haven't even come across an article saying it's not God who's the Ancient of Days in Christian literature. It may exist. I do have an encyclopedia of early Christian teachings, and I haven't looked it up. So
Right.
it's possible. But I've read and I've researched from time to time this very issue to see if I could find something contrary to that. And I haven't run across it. I don't, and if it did, it's so obscure, like who cares? Most every Protestant you'll ever speak to, if you say, who is the Ancient of Days, pastor, priest, layperson, if they know, they're going to say God, period. So Joseph, being in the midst of that culture where people tended to know their religion better than they do now,
Yes.
and Christians tended to know their scriptures better because they sat around and read a Bible at night. That was the American pastime. I mean, families don't do that much anymore, and very few do, but that used to be the mainstay of what people did. They read the Bible at night by candlelight when they couldn't do anything else. And so when Joseph says Adam is the Ancient of Days, he just said Adam is God. And that's what pretty much everybody listening to him is going to infer. So you could say, well, you know, Brigham says, oh, well, Adam is God, and Joseph taught that, and that's where he got it from. And then he interpreted all this other stuff. But these minute meetings explicitly say Joseph taught thus and so. And it's got a list of, 6 or 7 points of Adam-God teachings that he said came from Joseph, not from him.
Yeah.
So,
And see, that's hugely fascinating, right? Because as you said, look, most Mormons now are fairly far removed from Protestantism, right? Um,
yes.
even myself, who came in out of, not being a Mormon at all, um, I didn't understand certain things about verbiage in Joseph's day, right? There are certain things here that sometimes I think we take for granted and we just simply superimpose upon our views of history rather than taking a step back and going, okay, is this really what they did, right?
Yes.
Um, it's kind of a weird form of presentism in some ways. And
Yes.
so, like you just brought out with Joseph's teaching there on the Ancient of Days, um, if everybody believes that the Ancient of Days is a god, and then Joseph says Adam is the Ancient of Days, it's that's as good as anything else you're going to find that he's saying Adam is God.
Yeah.
And if as you pointed out, you've done all your searching, right? I imagine that the concordances would be a good indication of that, right? I think they spell that out a lot in those concordances of what the Protestants are thinking about certain terms in the day.
Yeah. As
And
do Bible
so,
dictionaries, present
right,
and contemporary to Joseph's day.
yep. And so all of those things, I like you have to take the you have to view it through their eyes, right? Or else
Yeah,
it's a lot of things are going to fall
yeah.
completely flat.
And quasi reasonably, and I say that with quotes, quasi reasonably, people have argued and said, well, Joseph taught a lot of things that were very different from Protestantism, and he just meant something else.
Right.
Well, that could be a decent argument, except one massive flaw. You don't see Joseph distinguishing and
Mm,
explaining that, which is what he typically did. He would say, well, you've heard this, Protestants teach this, but let me tell you the real thing. He didn't do that. He just said, Adam is the Ancient of Days, over and
yeah.
over, lots of times.
Yep.
And he doesn't make an apology for it and say, oh, by the way, um, I don't mean he's God, like the Protestants would assume here. I just mean, they've got that part wrong. He says stuff like that constantly in his discourses. So not seeing that to me is an additional evidence that's just what he meant. Not to mention we've got Council of 50 minutes. We now have these private quorum minutes that didn't see the light of day for 150 plus years, or whatever, 140 whatever years. But you know what I mean? And then you've got other places, people testifying. It's just the historical evidence that Joseph Smith taught Adam-God teachings has grown compelling and continues to grow more compelling. It's one thing to say, well, there are all these affidavits from people saying they taught it, but Brigham forced them, he tricked them, he made them write it, or else their membership would be lost. But we don't have proof of that, but it's pretty obvious. All this sort of argument is fine. Make your apologetics. But when you start seeing the Council of 50 minutes, they're pretty obvious. And then you see this at the private minute meetings, it's even more obvious. He's deliberately declaring this is Joseph's teaching. You know, I mean, how
So
much more blatant do you need?
yeah, so let me push here on this a little bit, Drew, because I something just occurred to me here. Ooh, and that is this. Joseph said that Adam is the Ancient of Days hundreds of times, correct?
I don't know if there's 100 or not. Let me see. I've got my ancient days. I've got 29 pages of it in Adam-God teachings.
Okay,
So I would estimate probably there's like 50 quotes or something. Two to a page is maybe average, maybe
okay.
more.
If it's that obvious in that time period, could we make a reasonable assumption that Orson Pratt would have heard that at some point? Joseph
Right.
make that statement.
Yeah.
Okay,
So
so
why
if
doesn't Orson
Joseph is
Pratt know that?
making that statement, then how does Orson say that he wasn't teaching Adam-God through that?
Yeah.
And then what is the motivations for Orson here, right? Because look, I usually operate from a standpoint of giving somebody the benefit of the doubt, right? I don't think anybody sets out to be wrong. And likewise, I don't think anyone ever wants to be a contrarian just so he can be hated by the guy
Mhm.
up top, right?
Right.
So do you have any sort of opinions or ideas here on what is driving Orson to do this? Because he would have had
Yeah.
to have heard this at some point from Joseph himself, right?
Well, he did not hear precisely that Adam is God. He never heard that from Joseph. That's why Brigham calls in Heber C. Kimmel, Willer Richards to testify that they heard Joseph teach it, and specifically said, we will each become an Adam on an earth of our own.
Right.
And then he explains the mechanism, how that works, so that Orson Pratt can understand it, because clearly he didn't understand it. So I think it's curious that Orson Pratt doesn't ever look at that and say, well, he did teach this, but he must have been something else. What he does say is, I found my beliefs not on Brigham, who I think is an error in judgment on this issue, but on Joseph's revelations. And then he quotes common Christian teachings. And frankly, the modern church's mainstream LDS teachings come from Orson Pratt.
Hmm.
So they were very familiar. Jesus is Jehovah, and Jesus is the first fruits, and Adam was just a prophet, and all that stuff came from Orson Pratt. He's the one that started teaching it like that. And it was at this very time when he's getting in trouble with Brigham that he was teaching that stuff. So later, when they're saying we need to get rid of Adam-God teachings, they're causing too much trouble and fight and dissension, he had already provided for them the theology that would make it work. So his words, his explanation is, I'm following Joseph's teachings and revelations and his understanding of them, which I think is a kind of a fair estimation of him. Uh, one of the other interesting things about these minute meetings is some of the teachings Orson Pratt had been giving. It was clear to me dozens of years ago that Orson Pratt was misunderstood by Brigham Young. And maybe Brigham had good reason to misunderstand. As somebody was commenting to me today about a certain excuse me, a certain um, philosophical belief in the attributes of deity and so forth, that maybe Brigham just said, "Oh, he's teaching this," but really Orson Pratt was more mid ground than he thought he was, and that may be where the miscommunication comes from. But it appears, and I say appears because it's not super clear. The record is not awesome. It's not a word for word translate or record of the meetings. But it appears that Orson Pratt tried to explain a little bit better what he meant, and he and Brigham agreed. And then Orson Pratt, rather than taking that as hooray, we have some common ground, he starts attacking Brigham again. So there is that. Um, there are a couple really controversial statements that are made in those minutes too that I don't know if anybody else has noticed or made kind of apparent, but I do on my podcast. I don't know if you want to skip those now, but I'm just throwing that out there.
No, no,
Um,
let's tackle them.
okay, number one controversial statement, and I don't have this in front of me, but I have a quote from Brigham somewhere in my research, and I always think I should look it up because it comes to mind a lot in modern conversations. Um, I read a paper recently that talked about early pioneer beliefs about when the spirit enters a fetus.
Hmm.
And Brigham Young taught that it is about the fourth month when the fetus or the spirit enters the fetus. And he may not have said fourth month. It's been so long since I've read it, but that's my recollection. But he says when the mother begins to feel the baby move, that's when she knows the spirit has entered the fetus. That was a common pioneer belief. So was he teaching that from Revelation, or was it a common pioneer belief? That I've wondered about for a long time because of the abortion question. Early saints used that belief to swallow abortives early in pregnancies to abort the fetus and didn't ever express any stress or regret or worry about it. There are plenty of discourses from the early brethren uh, disapproving vehemently abortions, but they are talking about taking the life of a child. So when you read Brigham's statement in context of that, you think, well, did they believe that only after the woman felt it or before, and there are problems with that standard anyways. I once home taught a woman who didn't know till about her fifth month of pregnancy she was pregnant because one, she's very large and apparently that affects things. But two, she didn't feel the baby move until about the fifth month. And then she's like, what was that? What's going on? And then of course took a test. So in the minute meetings, there is a phrase in the middle of Brigham talking doctrine, as it were, saying that when a mother feels the spirit enter the baby, blah, 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 he's describing, and there's a specific word for the pioneer belief. I don't remember what it was,
A
but
quickening.
yeah. He's describing that process. It the record's not good. Again, it's incomplete. It's incomplete sentences. It's missing stuff. We don't have context. It seems out of the middle of nowhere, but it's in the middle of these. These are doctrinal teachings that were received by revelation, and then he says that. Now, was he expanding upon stuff that he received and understood, or was he explaining this as part of his doctrine? And that's extremely controversial for the reasons I've already stated, because you can take that teaching and say, I think my daughter gets raped. I think that's a good reason for me to give her an abortive right away. and not wait the 3 or 4 months. And I'm good with God. But we don't have that kind of strong clarity on the issue. So I'm certainly not saying that's the correct understanding, whatever. I'm just saying that's how it can be read, and that's why it's controversial. Now, from a doctrinal perspective, we have zilch. We have the brethren condemning very fervently against abortions. And so, from that perspective, at any rate, I think it's a fascinating question. I think clearly there is a point when it's extremely wicked to do so. I think there's a question as to when that point arrives, and Brigham Young brings that to the fore by introducing that teaching. And in his other discourses, I think you could say, yeah, Brigham also said that hair bleeds, and that's why I like to have his hair burnt instead of cut. And Brigham said that doing the waltz inflames the senses, so it's a wicked dance. He had his cultural things too. And
Well, yeah, oh, sorry, go ahead, finish.
so you've got these things. He could have been saying that with the quickening concept in a public discourse, and we could dismiss it as that. These minutes, to me, bring the question up afresh and a little bit more disturbingly, because um, he's teaching doctrine and he says it in the middle of it, but we don't clearly know what he said either. So between those two things, it makes kind of a mess out of what do we take from those minute meetings. So that's one of the controversial things.
Before we move on to the second, I do have some context for this actually. This is interesting
Okay.
you brought this up. So this idea of the quickening when the mother feels the baby move, that actually was in practice before the restoration. So there's a couple of
Yes.
cases
Yeah.
back in New England, and I believe it was either Rhode Island or maybe Connecticut. I can't remember. Anyway, it was about a woman who had taken a tea that was supposed to induce an abortion. And
Mhm.
when asked about it, it was, I don't think it was one of the founders, but it was kind of founder adjacent, right?
Yeah.
And he had asked, he'd kind of thought about this and said, well, from a legal perspective, it would be the quickening, right? Once she knows she's pregnant.
Right. Yeah.
And
Yeah. Yeah.
so I do find that interesting, right? Because Brigham, if I'm not mistaken, is born in Vermont, correct? Or is it Vermont Brigham's born in, or is it New Hampshire? I can't
It sounds
remember.
good to me. It's one of those
Yeah.
triangle states.
Yes, exactly. And so if that was the common understanding there, it does make me like you. I wonder, right? Is this
The cultural
historic?
or doctrinal?
Right, exactly. And then I always have to ask the questions, you know, what would Brigham think today if he could have benefits of an ultrasound? Or, the ways that, a child is more viable outside the womb today, earlier than ever before in history.
Yeah,
Does that change his mind? Right. And so like I do have to ask those questions, right? Is this
exactly. Yeah,
revelation or is this cultural precedent that he's been exposed to up in New England?
precisely. And that's where I was coming before. I would look at it and say, gosh, I'm glad I don't have to worry about it. You know what I
Right,
mean?
right.
I hope I never have to worry about that. I need to know the answer to this question. Um, but before I had to look at it and say, well, could have been a cultural thing, and there's a reasonable likelihood it's a cultural thing. With the meeting minutes, it doesn't answer the question, but he is teaching in the midst of these are doctrines. It makes me at least look at it a little bit more carefully than I looked at it before to say, well, maybe he's not teaching culture here because he's trying to prove to Orson Pratt this is Joseph's teaching, and then I also received a revelation on it, and here's how it works, and he includes
Right.
that in the here's how it works. So it doesn't look like culture. It looks like he's saying, I'm telling you doctrine, swallow it. But we also don't have enough detail to know exactly what he meant, or if he had added extra details or said, oh, by the way, I learned the quickening was at 1 month and 2 weeks. You know what I mean? At any rate. So it's really just a point of interest. It's a curiosity. It's fascinating. If I ran across a man who said, Drew, my daughter got raped. It's this really bad situation. Could be really bad for her health. It's 1 week ago. What do you think of RU-486? You know, which is an abortive pill.
Yep.
Um, I'd have to say, well, here's what I know. Go pray about it. Here's what Brigham taught. Don't know if this is cultural. Don't know if it was doctrine. Here's the situation. Here are the facts. Look at it. Go pray about it. I'm not your judge, man. You know, I'm
No.
I'm 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 not going to be his judge. And I'm glad I don't have that position because we don't have enough information. And honestly, that's again, I don't want to have to pray about that. If that's me that has to pray about that, well, my daughter's got a 60% likelihood of dying if she goes through with this after being raped by this really bad person. And now I got to advise her what to do. I don't ever want to be there. But if I am there, this is the information that I would look to and say, okay, now I'll pray about it. So
Yeah.
that's what it's worth to me.
Look, you and I are both in agreement that it's an absolutely abhorrent practice, right? However,
At least the modern
it,
version of it is. Yes.
yeah,
The T
well,
thing at 2 days old is maybe not aberrant um, in quite the same degree.
I would say this, right? Like I would like you, I would say go pray about it, right? And I do tend to think if you're still conflicted at that point, choose the side of life, right?
Yeah. Right.
Um,
Yeah.
just because that's the safer option.
Right. It's better than
But
being a son of perdition.
right, exactly.
If you're
But
wrong, that's
yeah,
your choice.
absolutely. Yeah, I'm like you. I have no desire to make those calls for people. I just I don't. Now you come to me and say, "Look, this is really going to screw up my ability to fit in that red dress." I'm going to have a different take, right? Um
Yeah.
I'm going to be like, "Yeah, you don't need to pray about this one. Have the kid." Um
Yeah.
but in some of those very rare circumstances, yeah, I try to stay out of that as much as I can. So what was the second thing you found? You said there were two things that you found in there that were kind of controversial.
Yeah. So, no, um, okay. I know what one of the other one was as well. And, this is maybe even more academic than the other, but I thought it was interesting, because I've heard the teaching coming out of certain LeBaron groups, and Brigham appears to allude to it in the minute meetings. However, I wasn't expecting to talk about this, or I would have pulled it up so I could have the exact verbiage.
My
You can
bad.
see
If you're not
see what it
comfortable,
is.
we can skip it.
Oh, it's no, it's okay. It's again, this isn't like doctrine according to Drew. This is what is in the minute meetings. What could it mean? And we're left from there. But I think it's significant, not just doctrinally, but because of practices of certain groups of fundamentalist Mormons. So Brigham, and this is not his words, though it's choppy, it's a little bit unclear, but he appears to be saying, you'll never believe this, but some brother came to me and suggested that I have marital relations with his wife, something to that effect.
Right.
And again, it's not super clear, but you're reading, you're like, what? Because he basically says he doesn't use these words, but he says you'll never believe this, but this actually happened. And then he makes this comment, and I know, and it's not speculation, but I know for a fact that at least one LeBaron group does practice that idea that you should give your wife to the prophet. I know children born from that, so I know that's a thing, and good people. So no judgment at that level either. But I know that some people are extremely disturbed by that teaching, and I know that some people say, well, Joseph did ask for all the wives of the 12, but he didn't take them. But some of them were still pretty ticked about it and thought it was still real. and Nancy Miranda Hyde and, William Law's wife that Joseph was, sealing to him after William Law died, and blah, blah, blah. And so there's controversy there, and there are some groups teaching that and practicing that. And so finding it in the minutes, even though he doesn't say I did it, um, is of note, because apparently that teaching was around, or somebody was believing or thinking that at that time. But notably, from the context in an incomplete record, it appears pretty obvious to me that Brigham said no. And can you believe you had the nerve to ask me? So for most people, that's a happy ending to that part of the story, but the controversy remains. And there's, of course, this statement from Joseph Smith that's also used. It says, well, to consecrate your wife means precisely to consecrate her to the work of God and not in any other way. So, we've got that quote from Joseph too, but that's not been enough to dissuade certain groups from teaching that, because Joseph also said, I'm accused of having 30 wives and I can only find one. Well, quit
Right.
staring at her. You might find the others in the audience. There were at least 7 that were present when you made that statement. So, we've got these controversies in different groups over things like that. So seeing that in the minute meetings was a complete surprise to me. And again, that's not something that I'm in any way advocating or saying is true or anything remotely like that. But it is one of the controversial things that I found in the minutes that I thought that's notable. That's
Right.
a notable sidebar. I mean, that somebody actually asked him, like, Brigham being the personality he is, can you imagine approaching him and how he might respond if he wasn't, on board with what you were suggesting? Expect a crowbar across the head or something. I don't know. That's pretty
That would
bold.
at least be
Right.
entertaining to watch, right? And I can't wonder if it was a couple guys falling out of the saloon going, I double dog dare you to go ask him, bro.
Right.
Um, uh,
Right. That would be great
no,
context to find. We'll get that one 20 years from now and
right.
look back and say, "Ah, there you go. That was awesome."
I did read that one, and I'm like you. To me, it sounds like Brigham's going up there, not being like, guess what I just did, but more like, dude, you wouldn't believe what just happened to me. Right.
Yeah.
It's definitely the latter. It feels more in context, I guess. But
Yeah.
dude, fascinating stuff. And we're getting more and more of these leaks now. I shouldn't say leaks, releases, right?
Yeah.
Of these older minutes. And it really is adding some context to a lot of things, which is good. It's something we've missed out on for a while.
Yeah. It's extremely gratifying to have these things available, for
Yep,
sure.
absolutely. So let's move on to the two books. So the first one is called Adam-God Essentials. And it's from the way you described it, it's kind of like that was the one that was like Adam-God for Dave, right? Like really
Mhm.
super simple, maybe even a few pictures in the book or something. Um, or is that the one for was that the one for the teens?
Yeah, exactly. So I'm going to call it Essential Adam God Teachings,
Okay.
because it's just the bare essentials. So I'll give you a little bit of context so this will make more sense. When I wrote Adam God Teachings, there were 5 or 6 books about Adam God. There's Ogden Kraut's, there's Joseph W. Musser's, there's Cully Christensen's, there's Craig Tholson's. Who am I missing? Seems like there's another one. But at any rate, there were a number of Adam God books and lots of articles. And when I wrote Adam God Teachings, I was kind of annoyed at all of them. They were all cherry picked. This is what I think, and this is what I want to teach. And I wanted to say, I don't know who, and no disrespect intended, but I don't know, and I don't care who Joseph Musser is. I don't know, and I don't care who Ogden Kraut is. And now I obviously know who they are now.
Right.
But at the time, I didn't know. And I was like, I could
Right.
care less who Cully Christensen is. He seems like a nice guy, but that doesn't mean I believe what he wrote. Get
Right.
rid of your Adam is God in brackets, and write down what Brigham said. Write down what Heber C. Kimball said. I don't care what you say. And that was my whole motivation. And I wanted it to be exhaustive, to have everything that had ever been published on it. When I did my 2023 rewrite, there were literally only about 4 pages of quotes out of 700 some that were new, and none of them added any new doctrine. So that was my intention, my purpose. And when I got done at a normal 6x9 size, it was 1,000 pages. And then nobody's going to buy this 1,000 pages of Adam-God teachings. So I oversized it, changed the font, reformatted some things, and messed with the margins type thing to make it palatable, that it wasn't too big to buy, and then did everything I could to make it look as academic as possible, including really nice front and back covers made out of parchment paper, and all those types of things. After that, for years, I had a lot of people say, Drew, why don't you write a simple basic version of Adam-God teachings? And I didn't want to do it. I'm like, these other guys did that. But I don't want this doctrine according to Drew stuff. That's just not what I want to put out there. I tend to have people say on a regular basis, I disagree with Drew, he taught this and so. But what I said was, some people believe, or there's evidence of, but I'm not sure what to think about this, but, just like with the things we were just talking about, you know, do I believe people should be sharing their wives with the prophet? If your prophet says that, I suggest you run. But, you know, that's my personal belief. But I will tell you that, I can find evidence in favor of it. I can make the argument for you. I could write an academic paper to suggest that that's what Joseph was really trying to teach, you know, but that doesn't mean I believe it. That just means I can find historical evidence for those things. So you see what I'm saying? So a lot of people kind of misconstrue what I think already, because I
Right.
include it, but they think that's what Drew believes, and that's just not the case. I'm trying to present all sides of every issue. And I'm sure I fail because my bias helps me not see something, but I really, really honestly try. And so I didn't want to write a book that here's doctrine according to Drew. Um, but I've continued over and over and over the years. People say, Drew, do you have a version for my teenager? He's not going to read that book. You know, you drop it on your foot, you break your toe. It's too big. He's not going to read it. Do you have something for my teen? Um, and so finally, and I've got 15 kids, and the vast majority of our teens were teens. And so I look at it and I say, gosh, you know, uh, it would be helpful to have a shorter version. So that's helpful context, because this is basically what I did. I went through each chapter. First chapter, Adam is father than God, is God the Father. There's 40 pages of quotes. There's over 100 quotes. They all say the same thing. None of them say Adam is father of our spirits. None of them say Adam is father of Christ. None says God is the father of our spirits or God is the father of Christ. They say Adam is God. Very specifically. I was very careful to distinguish those things, because it really annoyed me reading earlier books when they say, well, this says Adam is God, and it says Adam is the Ancient of Days. That's
Right.
not what it says. And I get the extrapolation. I've already made that argument, but that's not what it says. So that's a separate chapter. So I took those 100 quotes and I maybe wrap it down to 2 or 3 or 4 of the very best quotes and say, this teaches the principle. And I go to the next chapter, Adam is father of our spirits. That's 9 pages long. I put 1 or 2 quotes, say this is what Brigham and the other brethren taught, maybe make some observations, keep it simple, and move on, and did that through the entire book. When it gets into the more complicated teachings, then I explain a little bit more, here's what this means, and here's what's going on. But I don't delve too deeply into it. I just give the basics. So, when I did Adam-God teachings, it's like 50 some chapters in there. Those are all different topics. And we can argue, if you say God is the father of our bodies, then that means Adam is God. I could argue the opposite. I can say, no, it does not mean that. If you understand mainstream Mormon teachings in the early 20th century, they meant that Adam and Eve had bodies that were made by God, that were immortal bodies, but then those fell, and then that's, the thing. So God is father of our bodies is by grandpa, not by father. Or, you can make the argument. It doesn't mean the same thing. Personally, doctrinally, does mean the same thing. That's what I believe. But philosophically speaking, textually speaking, they're different. So I differentiate them. It was important to be exhaustive about that in 2005, because nobody had done it. And there's so many theories about what it meant out there. I wanted there to be so many quotes about one topic that nobody could argue it anymore. And I don't even remember what some of the theories were, but I remember whenever I was writing the book, I was like, there are 50 quotes here that teach that that theory is wrong, and it's pretty obvious. I don't
Mhm.
even need to preach against it or explain. If people can't tell on their own, then sorry, but this is pretty obvious. So I just kind of left it there. So now that it's, been 20 years and time has passed and people want a simpler book and there's nobody out there writing, rather than do a doctrine according to Drew, I thought I'm just going to find the very clearest quotes, put them all in one spot, maybe a 200-page book. I don't know. I haven't looked at it recently. Um, and just have the very basics there, and then put that out as essential Adam-God teachings. Now, did I write it precisely in easy terms for your teen? Well, I'd have to convert some of the old English and all the quotes to make it really teen friendly from that perspective. So no, I didn't do that. But I did try and make, here are only three quotes, and then summarize them, make them simple, have bullet points at the end type thing, so that you can look and say, okay, here's what, in summary, basically, it's the table of contents is the teachings. But unless you read the quotes, you don't know what that some of those table of content entries mean. So I try and keep it super simple like that. That's my basic explanation of what it is. And when I stray from Adam-God teachings per se, and I talk about offices and titles, I try and shrink those chapters down to be a little bit more simplistic, but keep the basic idea there. And frankly, shockingly, most people don't read those chapters. And I think those are the most important chapters for people who struggle with the teachings to read. If you're a
Well,
mainstream member of the church and you're like, I just can't wrap my head around Adam-God teachings, read the offices and titles chapters in Adam-God teachings. And I think most people can walk away from that and get it.
okay, when you say that helps clear things up, in which way? Explain that to me.
So if I'm talking to you and I say, brother Zitting, you say, well, which brother Zitting? I know Tom and I know Joseph and I know, Frank and I know all these different Zittings. You're not confused when I say um, President Zitting, that I'm talking about the stake president in your area whose last name is Zitting. But if he quits being stake president, 10 years from now, I say President Zitting, you're not confusing. Oh my gosh, he's stake president again? I didn't know. When did he get called again? You're you
Right.
just recognize it's a title. And you're not confused when I say President Johnson, because you know that's the current president of the stake. Obvious. I don't say Elder Barlow, and you're not like going, oh my gosh, I already met an elder the other day. That name's getting so popular. You understand it's a title. This is not confusing.
Right.
But when we say um, Elohim is a title, Jehovah is a title,
Mhm.
we're like, no, it's a personal name. Well, who told you that? Because if you look through the Bible, you've got, you've got the great and mighty God, you've got the God of Israel, you've got the God of hosts of the armies, you've got all these different honorific titles for the name of God. And with all these different titles, you don't think, oh, that's the name of God. You do have the I am that I am Isaiah thing that some people say, well, that's his personal name. But if that's his personal name, then what do you make of the literally thousands of entries in the Old Testament where it says Elohim Jehovah or Jehovah Elohim? Who is that? If Jehovah is a person and Elohim's a title, then maybe you can get around that a little bit. But if you believe both of them are personal names, then you can't make any sense of it.
Mhm.
But if Elohim is a title, Jehovah is a title, and El is a shortened title, and this type of idea,
Right.
then if a passage says Jehovah says thus and so, or thus saith the Lord Jehovah, or thus saith the Lord God Elohim, you don't look at it and say, oh my gosh, okay, this contradicts this
Right.
because it's a title. Now, the reason I think this is significant, and I point this out in the book and hopefully made more clear in the revised version, Jehovah Witnesses have for decades used hundreds of scriptures that, when translated literally, that Jehovah is a name or Messiah is a name or whatever, that prove that Jesus is not Jehovah, because it specifically says Jehovah does not judge, or Jehovah is the great judge of all. And then Jesus says, I do not judge. Father sent me not to judge. I don't judge. Okay, so Jesus is not Jehovah. So they have hundreds of scriptures that teach that. They've got lists. You can go find those lists, and I include some of those lists in the book so that you can see, if you interpret literally, Jesus is not Jehovah. Now, Protestants do the same thing. Jesus is the greatest of all. Jehovah is the greatest of all. Therefore, Jesus is Jehovah. And Jehovah is the mighty one. Jesus is the mighty one. And so Jesus is Jehovah. They use the same logic both ways, but using that same logic, you get contradicting results.
I
To
see.
me, that makes it pretty clear there's something wrong with how you're interpreting. And if you're interpreting that way, I don't care which side you're on, I think you're wrong. Why? Because there are hundreds of scriptures that oppose you. If I adopt your way of reading and say this is the proper way to interpret this, I can find at least 100 scriptures that say you're wrong, interpreting the same way you just taught me to interpret this. So to me, that can't be right. There's a problem. And 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 again, from a Jew perspective, if you put yourself in the mind of an ancient Hebrew, that's kind of weird, anyways. I mean, you don't see Jews making that argument today, or that type of a thing, because they're not literalists like that. That's way too pharisaical for the ancient Hebrews. They used titles as honorific names almost exclusively for the name of God, because you couldn't say his name because that would be blasphemous. Now you say, oh, well, there you go. You said say his name. That's why they didn't want to say Yahweh, right?
Right.
But that changed over time, because it was one thing and then it changed to another, and they didn't want to say either name, so they changed it to something else. And historically speaking, we can see this tradition evolving. But at the end of the day, they were accustomed to honorary titles. They were accustomed to using those, and it's just not how you have to read it. And if you don't read it that way, then reading Jehovah Elohim thousands of times doesn't confuse you. And when you read, you know, Jehovah El Shaddai or something, it's not confusing. Well, wait, is this El Shaddai or is this Jehovah? I thought this said Elohim was El Shaddai because I interpret this literally. Now it's saying Jehovah is El Shaddai. Who is it? I'm like lost. All that goes out the window. It's unnecessary, and it's frankly just a really bad way to read scripture. And we know it's bad because it leads to contrary results. And you've got two denominations, big, at least broadly speaking, denominations, Protestants and Jehovah Witnesses, who absolutely despise each other's doctrines because they use the same method of teaching but read different scriptures and prefer different scriptures.
I see.
I'll use these 50, you use your 50, and we'll completely argue that you're wrong, even though your 50 are read the same way as mine are. I'll just say, well, I've got more, or mine are better, or mine are more clear, or whatever. How about you just take a step back and ask yourself, are either of us on the right track on how we're reading this? And I think when you understand those words or titles or offices, and you go back and you read the scriptures, they read extremely consistency in every place now. And you've got
Interesting.
divine investiture of authority in some modern scripture that causes some challenge, but that's it. But if you go and say that that's what the brethren were teaching, that these are titles, now things make sense. You can find, and I did a search back in 2005 to ask, who is Jehovah? I made a big chart, and I read 1,000 different, and I paid my secretary to type all these up so I could find them.
I hope your secretary was a fundamentalist. Otherwise, you freaked her out, bro.
She was awesome. Is one of my favorite people I've ever worked with, and she could
Okay.
type so fast. I gave her bonuses for increased her salary for typing fast, and after 1,000 words a minute, I had to quit. But I don't know where she ended up, but dang, she was fast. I give her what I thought was like 3 or 4 days worth of work because, I was working on a brief and she needed something to do. And she come in a couple hours later, done. I'm like, no, that's not possible. She'd have this, 50 pages typed up or whatever it was. Very impressive. But at any rate, I paid her to type up all these places where Jehovah shows up in Millennial Star, Times and Seasons, all these different places, so that I could read them objectively and say, does this definitively declare that Jesus is Jehovah? Or does this definitively declare that Jesus is not Jehovah? Or is it ambiguous and you can't tell? There's no way to tell. You can read it to mean Jesus is Jehovah. I can read it to mean Jesus is not Jehovah, and both could be right because there's no way to tell. So I went through those 1,000 quotes of only the early brethren using the term Jehovah. I expected, I don't know. I wasn't sure what to expect, but I was shocked by the results because I genuinely looked at everyone and said, is there a way I can interpret this in a different way? And when I do that, I think hard. I've got a degree in philosophy. I love doing this nerdy stuff. I think it's super important. And so if I can find a way to interpret it in a different way, that to me means I have to look at both ways and put it in the vague middle ground territory. And I don't remember the exact numbers. You can look it up in the book. But the number of definitive statements saying Jesus is Jehovah was very significant.
Mm.
The number of quotes saying Jesus is Jehovah, and I'm not talking about scripture, I'm not talking about D&C. This is the early brethren in early periodicals teaching, talking about Jehovah, whatever. I found like four. I don't remember, it could be six, whatever. There's very, very few that definitively declared Jesus was Jehovah. And I think three of those were referring specifically to D&C 109, where there's a divine investiture of authority issue. But at the beginning, it says, it sounds very much like it's teaching Jesus as Jehovah. And so not only were they not definitively declaring Jesus as Jehovah, they're really just quoting scripture that says that. And so it's not really an additional affirmative statement as much as a paraphrase or a quote of scripture. So very, very little of that. But that said, I found plenty of instances of the early brethren praying to Jehovah. There are quotes that say
Hmm.
Jehovah is God. There are scriptures that say Jehovah is the father of Christ. And, there are scriptures that say Jehovah is not Adam, um, and so forth. So when I finished that, I was really shocked. I expected more ambiguity, more, oh man, there are 50 quotes that say Jesus is Jehovah, 50 quotes that say Jesus is not Jehovah, just like the scriptures with the Jehovah Witnesses, man. It's just, banging heads. But instead, what I found is the early brethren mostly used Jehovah as a title. We're talking to God. They did not say Elohim is God as much as they said Jehovah is God. But, and, that's the kind of ambiguity I expected to find. But what I did find was there were quite a few quotes of them saying Jehovah as the Father of Christ, or Jehovah as the Father of our spirits, or we pray to thee, great Jehovah, send your Son to 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 the second coming or something. So there were a lot more quotes that ran the opposite from the early brethren than you would have expected, at least more
Let
than
me
I
ask
expected.
let me ask this question. Do we find in those quotes where they equated Jehovah as being the father of Jesus that you brought up? Do any of those come before the Salt Lake period? Would you know off the top of your head? If not, don't sweat it. I know it's a
I don't
random
I don't know
question to
off the
be
top of
asking.
my head. I can refer to you page numbers where you can find out.
Okay, let's do that.
It's
That
between
let's do
406
that.
and 440 where it just says Jehovah is not Christ. And they're chronological. So let me see if I can find that really quickly. Except for I've got it in the wrong program to do that. I'll just scroll for a while. What else do you want to chat about?
No, I find this interesting because a lot of times, like I tend to be a guy on most things, not all things, but most things, what is the consensus, not just that we're getting from Joseph, but what was the understanding of the people during his time, right? And some people have kind of said um that hey, this is a Salt Lake invention, so to speak, right? That Adam God
Yeah.
is a Brigham invention. As we pointed out here with look, I can see traces of Adam God and King Follett, right? I think
Yep.
it's all over the place. What you brought up about the Ancient of Days and Adam, I think is pretty clear. However, there are some that would say, well, this is a Brigham invention. This comes from Brigham. But my thought is that if we can find some of those quotes that happened in the Nauvoo period, that would square that squarely upon Joseph's shoulders because
Yeah.
they're getting it from somewhere. Does that make sense, or am I off in how I
Yeah.
would interpret that?
Yeah. And I did not distinguish about that in the book on purpose. However, um, I did specifically put everything in there chronological. So, for instance, the first Jesus is the Son of Jehovah, 1841. Joseph Smith, 1841. Millennial Star, 1842. April 1842, Millennial Star. Joseph Smith, 1842. First Presidency, 1845. So yeah, there were significant number in Nauvoo making those statements that Jesus is the Son of Jehovah.
Okay.
Was that specific one you were asking?
Yeah, yep.
Yeah.
Because that one, I think, causes a lot of prospective fundamentalists coming out of the LDS church a lot of heartburn because they've been raised with that narrative. You know what I mean? Now, there's
Yep.
nowhere in the endowment proper, right? Where, and a lot of times that's where these names slash titles really become super important. I shouldn't say become super important, where it's illuminated how important they are.
Yes.
And so you'll have folks that come out that are like, gosh, I just can't wrap my mind around this, right? And you wheel out some of those quotes and they're like, that's great, that's Brigham, but I need it to go back to Joseph, right?
Yeah.
And I kind of get their point too, right? I'm not saying
Yeah.
that they're wrong for
Yeah.
saying that,
Absolutely.
right? And so my
Water's clear
thought
at the
is that
fountain.
what's that?
The water is pure at the fountain.
Exactly. And so if we can find those quotes, and in my opinion, it doesn't have to come from Joseph, right? The fact that they're in Nauvoo and they're talking about it tells me that there's an understanding that's happening that Joseph has kind of enlarged his view of the Godhead, if you will, right? There's no doubt in my mind that I think Joseph was receiving things earlier than Nauvoo, but when he gets to Nauvoo, it's kind of peak Joseph Smith, right? He's
Yeah.
just
He's
gonna let,
unloading it.
yeah, he's gonna just let it go. And so if he is teaching those things in Nauvoo, just like you pointed out through your book now, we can show that this was on people's minds and there was this understanding in Nauvoo, which means that you can't squarely put that on Brigham. It's going to probably lead back to Joseph, would be my thought. If
Yeah.
that's a correct
Yeah.
exercise in historical thinking, you would be the guy to tell me if I'm off base there.
No, that's precisely why I did it the way I did. First of all, the entire book was done chronologically. I don't think I keep that in the essentials version because I just find the best quotes,
Sure.
and you know, I make mention a couple times in the book, maybe regularly, I don't know, to say, if this isn't convincing, these three quotes, there are 50 in the original. I'm just trying to distill this down to make it simple and easy, but there's a lot more evidence than is in this book. This is just so you get the ideas. Here are the ideas. And you have to trust me that these are the three quotes that say Jesus is not Jehovah, or Adam is the father of Christ, or whatever, that I'm not cherry picking. But
Right.
if you're worried about that, go get the original book. You've got hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of quotes in there spanning
Sure.
decades. And if you're not convinced reading that, you're not going to be convinced reading anything because that's everything we've got.
Well,
But um, but this is the simplified version. And I think when you look from those perspectives, though, when I did the Jehovah teaching, and this is something I take pride in. I wasn't trying to prove anything. I wanted to know. I was like, holy Hades. I'm reading all this fundamentalist literature. I wasn't a member of the fundamentalist group yet. I'm reading this fundamentalist literature, and they say Elohim is the father of Jehovah, and that Jehovah is the father of Christ. The church says Jesus is Jehovah, and Elohim is his father. Who's right?
Mm.
Well, I found out the church has lied about a number of doctrines, so that makes me a little bit suspicious, historically speaking, who to believe. But this is important to me. I want to know. So I grabbed up 1,000 quotes, everything I could find at the time digitally that was available to me to search and research a PDF or whatever. Had my secretary type them up and organize them for me. Um, Meaning, here's all Luna Star, here's all times and season or whatever I had access to. And the word Jehovah shows up, then she typed it up for me. And because you could still search the PDF back then. That's not just new technology, it's somehow back then.
Hey,
But I wanted to type it up because I wanted it available. I expected to insert them, a lot of them, and it turned out I did not near as many as I expected. So I kind of wasted a bunch of money there, but kept her busy, so that's good. Um, but at the end of the day, I wanted to know who's right, the church or the fundamentalists. Because the fundamentalists, the literature they put out is really bad. It still continues to be pretty bad when I see articles or papers or whatever, and I can tell it's by a fundamentalist. I'm hugely skeptical, and I don't say that to be rude. I'm one of them, as it were, but a lot of times their research skills or their logic is very inconclusive, imprecise, cherry picked, not including all the evidence for and against. And to me, that's just bad scholarship at every level. When I teach my kids every week Sunday school, I make sure to say, Protestants read this scripture to mean this. Jehovah Witnesses and Catholics read it this way, and Mormons read it this way. This is what Joseph taught. Make sure that they see there's more than one way to read this. Um, and and maybe even here's a couple perspectives of different people over time. Early Christians believe this, and modern Christians don't, and Mormons believe this, but I want them to see all different angles of it, and that's what I was trying to do. And so when I'm putting forth that information, that's me searching, not me preaching. Same thing when I wrote Silence and Mormon Polygamy. I didn't write that because I believe John Lawrence C. Woolley were prophets. I wrote that precisely because I didn't know. I was, yes, involved with fundamentalism at the time, but I didn't have a testimony of that particular thing. And it was a very important thing. And it kind of bothered me that my testimony was as narrow about the priesthood being in these groups as it was. And I wanted to know more. And I really hoped that at the end of writing that book, I would have a testimony and be like, God told me all these things. And, I did all the research. And so as a reward, he gave me a pat on the back and said, here's testimony and, whatever. But it didn't quite happen like that. Um, but still, it represents me searching, not me preaching, and I continue to do that. But that's what was happening with this Jehovah section, which is why to me it was a very powerful learning lesson because I didn't know what to expect. I just want to know who's right, church or not church.
yeah. When you first told me about this, the book you were writing here, the Essential Adam-God Teachings, right? That's the name of it.
Yes.
Um, I was excited for that, mainly because, like Drew, I remember coming in cold, as it were, right? And in those days, it was just me on 5 acres in western Idaho, trying to
Mhm.
parse this out.
Yeah.
And you start reading some of that stuff, and it gets awfully darn confusing, right? Even some of the better stuff that I read, and there was some good stuff that I read, but even the better stuff had some stuff, right?
Yeah.
And I remember thinking to myself, man, I wish there was an easier format, right? Like I could pick up and just give me the basics, right? Help me
Yeah.
answer some of the basic questions
Don't give me
about
Drew's
Adam
book, man.
God.
Give me something easier.
Right, right. We'll move on to the heavier stuff when I get there, right? Because look,
Yeah.
Adam
Yeah.
God is it is a gift in a lot of ways because it's going to absolutely force you to expand your mind and sometimes uncomfortably so, but that's okay.
Yeah.
Um, but nonetheless, it is expansive in its theological ramifications. And if we're not giving it due diligence, then we're never going to get to that. And as I go back to John, where it says, this is life eternal, right? To know who God is, paraphrasing there, and Jesus Christ, whom He sent, I take it literally, right? There's something in the knowing that seems to be vitally important. And so when you're left with what I ultimately ended up having to do is after reasoning through all that is just kind of say, okay, I'm just going to say a prayer and ask if it's true. And if it's true, then I guess I'm just going to have to live with never explaining it, right? Or
Yeah.
explaining it
Yeah.
well. Now, I will say this, I got my spiritual witness of it. Um, and over time I could start to see things pop out at me in the scriptures, right?
Yeah.
But it took me a long time, Drew. And
Yep.
look, some of that might just be because I'm me, but
No,
um,
it's
it
I love a quote. One of the brethren, I want to say Franklin Richards, but I definitely am open to correction there. But he says, we're told that some of the things of this dispensation have never been revealed before. And how do you expect to find something in the scriptures that's never been revealed before? He's talking about
right,
Adam-God teachings. I think that's dead on. So it's addressing exactly what you're saying too. I don't think you're being dense. I just don't think there's much. Um,
right,
I could make a compilation and be happy to have quotes and stuff. Other people have done that, but some of them are a stretch.
yeah,
So
yep, yep. So no, that's great. Is if there was one thing that you struggled with when you were trying to figure out Adam God as you first came in, because you were kind of like I am. You were a convert to the LDS Church first, and then you read the stuff and you took it serious and went for it.
yeah,
What was the thing that you struggled with most with that doctrine when you first heard it?
with Adam-God teachings.
Yeah.
Oh, the fact that the brethren lied about it. That was the hardest.
Okay. Yeah.
So so I when I first ran across it, was actually my father-in-law who started preaching it to me. And not preaching it, that's not true. He was just talking about it. And I
Okay.
said, I've read everything the church has put out on that, and he didn't teach it. And he said, I don't know, Drew. I've read this book this guy gave me, and it really looks like he did teach it. And I don't know what to make of it, but he did teach it. And this is the same guy that later was infuriated at me for saying that some of the early brethren lied about polygamy and some things like this. The brother would never lie, but they sort of lied about the Adam God thing. But he let me borrow the book, and he later said if I would have known it was going to convert you, I would have never let you borrow it. But and anyway, when I read the book, I noticed something very consistent. It was Craig Tholson's book. I've never met Craig. I don't know a whole lot about him. I've heard people talk badly about him. Um, and I didn't really like his book. But this was my experience reading his book because it was the only thing I had. When I read his commentary, I felt yucky. Mostly he's like, the brethren need to repent, they need to teach this stuff, and they don't know as well as I do, and shame on them for not teaching it and
Mm,
keeping from the saints from having gospel truth. I hated that flavor. It just didn't feel right. And looking back 20 some years, I believe in Adam-God teachings. I don't talk that way about the church. I don't talk that way about the presidents. I don't talk that way about Heber G. Grant, who's my least favorite of all the presidents. Um, I just don't think that kind of animosity or tearing somebody else down is ever the road to salvation. Joseph specifically said, you will never find the saints tearing down another denomination. And I very much strongly, so I always felt yucky reading his commentary.
right.
And I'm trying by the fruits you shall know, right? But when I read Brigham's quotes, when I read Heber C. Kimball, when I read Um, uh, who's the other one that was the Jedediah Grant, or some of these other people. When I read their quotes on Adam-God teachings, I felt the Spirit. I was like, man, this is confusing. Feel the Spirit a lot from this book, and don't feel the Spirit from this book. And it didn't take too long to recognize the pattern. And when I did, I quit reading Tholson's commentary and just read the Brethren's quotes. And that's when things started changing for me. And but it still bothered me, this idea that the Brethren were lying about it, because they're like, it was never taught. And now I've read dozens of quotes that it was taught. And Brigham Young or Bruce R. McConkie is saying you've got to have the intelligence of a pissant to believe in Adam-God teachings. And then here's 30 quotes of Brigham Young teaching Adam-God teachings. Like, I'm really struggling with this. These are men that are supposed to be our spiritual idols, as it were. And I don't mean that in the vernacular of worshiping idol. I mean that vernacular of the standard, right?
Yeah.
So that really, really bothered me. Well, um, as I was getting toward the end of the book, I was getting more and more convinced that Adam-God teachings were true. But the but then Bruce R. McConkie is labeling it as one of the seven deadly heresies. And I don't want to be deceived. So I'm like, well, what do I do? Well, James 1:5, that's what Joseph said to do, right? Man lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who giveth all men liberally, upbraideth not, so forth. So I knelt down, and my wife went to sleep early that night. I knelt down and I said, Father, I'm going to finish this book tonight. I didn't know what I was going to read. It was October 8, 1854 discourse. But I said, I don't know what I'm going to read tonight, but I need a testimony, true or false. I need to get past this season in life of not knowing. And I've had impressions yes, impressions no. Church says it's false. I don't want excommunicated. I also care more about the truth than I care about whatever's going on. I can keep my mouth shut. If it's true, the brethren were supposed to take it away from us because we're bad. I'm good with that, but I want to personally know. And that was my whole perspective of how to reconcile the brethren lying about it, was that God told them to. The same as Jesus said, Moses gave you this bill of divorcement idea because of the hardness of your heart, but in the beginning it was not so. He's authorizing the prophet to teach false doctrine because of the hardness of the heart of the people. So that's just what I adopted at the time. And I literally had an experience that night where every page I turned, I felt an increase of the spirit. And it was a noticeable wave. It wasn't
Mm.
like, oh, I'm just slowly feeling more and more of the spirit. It happened when I turned the page. And so it was more obvious to me observing what's going on. And as I only had a few pages left, I remember I prayed and said, Father, I asked you to give me a testimony, true or false. And if this isn't right, you're not doing a very good job teaching me, because, I'm feeling more and more inclined to believe it. Because I still wanted truth more than anything, but I also wanted to know it was true.
Right.
So by the time I finished that discourse, I knew it was true. And all of the ramifications didn't bother me at all. And I knelt down that night and I had the most spiritual conversation with God I'd ever had. And I remember so much that he was excited. And I said, why are you excited? I mean, I get why I'm excited. I just learned this really cool new stuff. But I'm a nobody. Why are you excited that I'm learning this? Because I felt that very clearly in his words and his tone, how he was speaking to me. And he said, you have any idea what it's like to be the father of all of these people? And almost none of them know who I really am. Almost none of them know my
Mm.
true sacrifice of what I've done for them.
Mm-hmm.
And most of them believe Adam's this wicked guy who screwed everything up, you know, and all of these things. And it didn't hit me as hard then. I only had two kids, but now that hits me really hard as a dad. You know, uh, I was talking to a teen the other day, and I was just like, you have any idea how many sacrifices that that I have personally made for you? Decades of working, of trying to provide, of trying to teach, of spending extra time staying up late to take care of something. There's somebody sick or somebody needs help or whatever. And for all my failings, as a dad, you do sacrifice a massive important part of your life to your children, and they don't appreciate it. I mean, same is true of moms. I'm not trying to exalt dads per se, but that was what he was communicating to me, and it really resonated. He's like, that's why I'm excited. I get to share this with very few people, but you found it, and I get to talk to about it with you. And you know, you can be the least of the saints, that's fine, but you're still one of my children, and I'm still excited that you found out. And so, because of that experience, there were no details that mattered to me that bothered me. I was like,
Right.
I don't know, whatever it is, but it didn't bother me. What bothered me was, how do I live in the church knowing this, not tell anybody, keep my mouth shut, um, and listen to week after week after week of Jesus is Jehovah, Jesus is Jehovah, Jesus is Jehovah. I bear my testimony that I know that Jesus is Jehovah. How am I going to live like that? That's what I really struggled with. Um, and so, I know a lot of people that, there's specific corners of it, but it just rang so true. And I had such an overwhelming
Hmm.
overflow of the spirit at that time that I've just never had any doubts at all. And I can read quotes that say, thus and so, Jesus is Jehovah. And somebody can say, see, Orson Pratt's right, and Brigham was wrong, and he made it up, and blah, blah, blah. And I couldn't care less. It just doesn't affect me. It doesn't faze me. Partially because of the titles thing, but mostly because I got my testimony that night. And then, at that point, that's when I said, I wish somebody had written a book that just has all the quotes of the brethren and not the commentary, or they separate that in a separate place or something, so I could just read what the brethren taught. And then the Spirit said, C.S. Lewis said that that's how he writes books. He thinks of a book that he wished someone had read or written and he wanted to read, and so he would write it. And I was like, I'm not writing that book. I'm not putting my head on the chopping block to get excommunicated. you know but of course that's exactly what I did.
Right. Right. The
um
first time I hear about Adam-God, it actually comes from a place of trying to catch up. So when I first joined the church, they use words that I just don't understand, right?
yeah.
At all. Coming in
Mhm.
cold, you know what I'm talking, right?
Yeah.
And you're just like, I don't get it. And so I was like, I was picking the brain of a friend, like, okay, if I wanted to catch up on all the vernacular, what should I do? And he's like, you need to read Mormon doctrine, right? Now,
Mhm.
he didn't mean read Mormon doctrine. He meant like peruse Mormon doctrine.
Right.
Take it slow. But that's not what
Yeah.
I did, Drew. I read
Right.
that bad boy like a novel, right?
Yeah.
And the first place I hear of Adam God is when Bruce R. McConkie says, anyone who believes this is on the high road to apostasy and will surely go to hell or something to that effect.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And I remember thinking about it at that time, like, this feels an awful lot like if when you bust a kid and he's got like cookies all like cookie crumbs on his face, and you walk in and before he can even say it, before you can ask, he says, I wasn't eating cookies, right? It had that
Yeah.
kind of vibe to it. And so
Yes.
I took it to, there was an old stake patriarch that we had. Good guy. I mean, like he was old when I joined back in 95. So like he'd seen some stuff, right? And
Yeah.
so he was an old farmer, and he always said, "You got questions, you come talk to me." And he had this great library, right? And I remember I went to him and I asked him, I'm like, "All right, what's Adam God?" And I remember his head dropped, and he's like, "You couldn't have asked about polygamy, right?" And I'm
Right.
like, "No, I need to know." And he's like, "Look, here's the general premise." And I'm like, "Do you believe it?" And I remember he just looked at me and he said, I think there's something to it, but I'm not going to go into it, is all he would say, which just,
Yeah.
and I was like, okay, if it's good enough for him, I'm going to treat it like that, right? Like there's
Yeah.
something to it. And then I didn't think about it for a decade. And then it was only when I dove headlong first into into fundamentalism,
Yeah.
that I was like, oh, I got to contend with this now. But I think you're right, and it sounds like we kind of came to it kind of the same way, right? You almost need a spiritual witness first, I think,
Yeah.
before it'll start making sense out of any text. Um,
Yeah.
but having said that, there is something to be said for doing what you're doing and being able to craft a piece of literature that someone can pick up and at least get the basics, right? Because, and maybe it's because I'm empathetic because I was there once,
Yeah.
but there are times when a new guy will come along and you start spouting at the lip about stuff, and he just looks like he drank out of a fire hose. And my
Yeah.
heart goes out to those folks. So I'm super excited for that one.
Yep. Yeah, well,
What
I would never have written it if I hadn't done the other first, because I feel like this has to have the foundation of the original, that I can say, look, you don't have to believe me. I remember. Who cares who Cognate Crowd is? Who cares who Joseph Musser is? Maybe later you'll accept him as a prophet. I don't care. But I remember that feeling. And I'm perfectly fine for people to say, well, who the heck is Drew Briney? Why do I care what he says? Great. Don't care what Brigham says. Care what Joseph said. And if you want the basics, here are the basics. But if you really want proof, you can go to the original book. So you don't have to trust me. And to me, that's super important. That's
absolutely.
crucially important. And so I finally felt like, okay, it's time. I'll do it. And at any rate, I don't know when it'll be out. I honestly, if I just dove into it, I could have it done in 2 days. Um, but I've got like 6 projects that are like that, and I'm behind months from being sick for so long, and yada yada. I could continue, you know. So it may be a month, maybe 2 months. I don't know. And honestly, I also want to hit really hard some other books. So I just finished doing a really strong edit of the Potter's Clay book that I was talking about, 150
Hmm.
pages of it. So I don't know which I'll do first.
Gotcha.
Maybe we should put a poll up and people can tell me.
There you go. There you go. Yeah,
I don't have a
that's
subscriber base. You do those. You do the poll.
I'll do the poll. We'll find out. How's that sound?
Okay. You want to
I'll
know more
attach
about
one
multiple
when
probations
I
or
drop
Adam-God
this
teaching?
episode. Yeah, when I drop this episode, I'll do a poll.
Okay, fabulous.
So so on the teen version one, how is it different from like the one that we just talked about, the essential Adam God
Oh,
teachings?
it's the same one. Same one.
It's the same one. Okay.
Yeah. The
Okay.
other version I'm doing is kind of the opposite. Exploring Adam-God teachings is the one I mentioned earlier. Everything that I've ever heard on the doctrine that I can't definitively disprove with Adam-God teachings, um, dig in deeper.
Okay.
So, when people say, okay, from an Adam-God perspective, and I'm only going to say this much, and from a temple's perspective, when you read Adam-God teachings and you look at the Lilith question, okay, what happened? What's if that happened, what happened, and how does that fit from an Adam-God perspective as opposed to, you know, first century apocryphal Christian writings or Jewish mythology or whatever? The early brethren talked about Lilith in terms of Adam-God teachings and plural marriage. So if she was a legitimate figure, how does she fit into the garden and all these types of things? So there's some really deep, hard questions with that, more than just the serpent seed type. Uh, I don't want to say garbage, but that's kind of how I feel about that particular doctrine. More than that type of a flavor, there's a really interesting things to ponder about that situation, what it might have looked like. Um, and so I delve into those types of questions. And you know, what about advancement progression of God's after the office of Adam? I've got about 10 quotes. I really need to look it up, but that say after you're exalted, then you will have to go through a probation like a Holy Ghost, then a probation like the Savior, then a probation like Adam. And so from that perspective, what are Adam-God teachings look like differently than how we usually see them? And that's where Orson Pratt's accusation against Brigham Young, saying Brigham taught that Jesus was exalted before he came to this earth. And he said it was so contrary to every revelation ever given. And Brigham doesn't deny it in the meeting minutes. Sadly, it's not in the new meeting minutes either. Um, but that introduces a whole new level of Adam-God teachings and how they fit into things and what it means and so on. And so I go into deeply exploring some of those other issues. And I probably suspect that as controversial and as heavy as I delve into some of those things, that it's still not going to satiate the diehards. You'll be like, "What, Drew? What about this?" And if I get any comments about that, I'll be like, "Chapter 27 definitively disproves that one." So, um, and maybe I should explicitly say so in some places, but I really don't like uh, debating that way. You know,
Right.
if I'm going to talk to somebody, I'll say, well, there's evidence of this, there's evidence of this, there's evidence of this. If they personally want to know what do I personally believe, I'll say, but I prefer to keep the communication that way. Well, Brigham said this, Joseph said this, Heber C. Kimball said this. You put those three together, suggest this. That's what we know, and leave it there. They can make their own conclusions. I don't like to say this is what I believe, although I shouldn't say I don't like it. It from an author's perspective, I don't like to do that very much. I try to avoid that. I much prefer to just say this is what Brigham taught, and maybe he meant this, maybe he meant this, and move on. And so, um, you know, uh, it's been a long time. I started writing Adam-God in 2001. So it's been 25 years since I started studying this heavily. It took me 4 years to write it because we didn't have databases back then. Or at least most people didn't have databases back then. And you certainly didn't have it for fundamentalist Mormon literature. You had to type everything up, or, not everything, but a good portion of stuff you had to just type up back then. So that's a long time to hear people's theories. And I still hear theories. What about the two atom theory that Brigham was really confused and really he was referring to two different atoms? And I look at that and people ask me that question every once in a while. I say, well, he obviously didn't read my book. I think if you read the whole book, you can't come away with that idea. It's kind of moronic or sophomoric. It shows cherry picking and lack of research. So I don't address that. I'm not going to talk about two atom theory because I think it's really poor scholarship and it shows cherry picking. And I hate cherry picking. If you read the whole book, you can't argue that anymore. You have to cherry pick to make that argument. So things like that won't be in exploring Adam-God teachings because I think I can definitively disprove it by the texts themselves. And if I can do that, I won't include it. But if there's something that's just really whack and out in left field, and I'm like, all right, I can't disprove that, it's of interest. It's going to find a footnote at least. I mean, it'll probably find a section of the main text that said, some will read this to mean this. And when it says that, that does not mean Drew Briney believes this whack interpretation of Lilith. It means that Drew heard this from somebody, and some people believe this, and you can think about it. And maybe it'll get you into some cool area of theology, understanding deeper than you ever have before. Maybe it'll make you start studying um, Mormon reincarnation, or maybe you just think weird.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I don't care because I think having the resource and exploring is the fun, you know? And if somebody has an idea and I disagree with it, it still can be interesting to me. And it might lead me to a new way of looking at things where I do learn some truth. And you don't know unless you know what you don't know. I love Socrates for teaching that teaching, and I've met an awful lot of people who are not as well read as I am on Adam-God teachings. That's some really interesting insights, and so I think those insights deserve some attention. And honestly, at this stage of my life, I don't feel like any of those things are really deep anymore. They
Mhm.
kind of feel like Oh yeah, there's that thing too. Here's another detail about it. It doesn't feel like, oh man, that's deep, or oh, that's super interesting. I've been saturated with it for so long because I finished 2005 and people have continued to talk to me about it ever since. I almost never hear anything new. I honestly, I can't think of the last time I heard anything that was new that came from somebody else. It's maybe been 10 years. It honestly,
Hmm.
it's just everybody's already speculated everything. So a lot of it feels a little stale to me,
Okay.
but I am more than certain, especially for newbies, it's way too much for a newbie. They're not going to want to read it until they read the other book. They might not want to read it until they finish my entire original book and then hit it after that. But there's a certain amount of people, and I know it's not a lot of, I'll probably be lucky to sell 100 copies or something. But those are going to be the guys that are going to feed me new stuff for the next 10 years. So they're going to say, Drew, you missed this. And I'll be like, wow, that's a good point. I'll be in the second edition if I ever write it.
You
So
know, so it sounds like this other volume is really going to kind of explore the maybe some of the theological ramifications as well as some of the theological speculation that can go along with Adam God.
yeah,
And I I was talking to a buddy the other day, and we're both kind of big into firearms, right? And
yeah,
one of the things I love about AR-15s is it's not just a gun, it's a platform, right? Like if like my daughters go to certain stores for accessories, I tend to like go to gun shows because I'm like, "Ooh, that would be a cool accessory for this gun." Right? And in some ways, Adam God is absolutely a platform, right? There's so many
yeah,
things that can be there too, right? And how many of them are true? I don't know, but it sure is fun to talk about.
yeah,
And
exactly.
and that's where I kind of tend to want to hang out in those arguments, right? Or
Yes.
those kind of discussions because I do feel like your religion should stretch you a little bit, right?
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
should be uncomfortable a little bit. That's healthy, right? Whether you're
That's how
lifting
you grow.
weights or
Yeah.
reading scriptures, it's
Yeah.
all about a little bit of discomfort goes a long ways towards personal growth.
Yeah.
But
100% agree. The only trouble I've really had with this volume is that it ends up pushing towards Mormon reincarnation, progression between kingdoms, and other items of eternal progression that are really part of my other series of books that I'm working on. And I'm like, well, I could just write those, but I really think this could be a nice springboard into seeing where those things could fit in. Whereas if when I'm addressing them separately, I'm not really showing all the correlations. I'm just saying, here's where Heber C. Kimball said this. For the first time in Potter's Clay teachings, we see him suggesting that the the new probation comes in between celestial and terrestrial kingdoms. And this is a whole new aspect, and here are the quotes that support it. That's a very different approach than saying, well, these Adam-God teachings kind of suggest these other ideas and just let you kind of think about it, as opposed to here's the proof and, you know, take it or leave it, but here's what we know.
interesting.
But it's still a hard line to draw.
It is. It
Because I
is.
just want to start writing that whole chapter from the other book. I'm like, no, 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 stop, stop, stop. Don't do it. It'll be
A
10
lot
years
of
before it's
carryover.
finished.
Yeah. No, I could see how that would drive you nuts, Drew. Whew. And that's why I do a podcast and don't write. Um,
Right. Well, I found I get a little bit lazy that way sometimes too. I'm like, well, I did the podcast. When I die, my kids can listen to that.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. There's kind of a joke that someday my great grandkids are going to pick up some of these that I've done and been. They're going to be like, the old man really believes some out there stuff.
Right.
Um, but nonetheless, it's good. Well, dude, I think that about does it. Then, is there anything we missed that you want to cover?
Ooh, I don't know.
I feel like we did a pretty good job talking about this, but I always want to make sure I'm not missing anything obvious.
Right. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, we hit so many so many different angles. You know, I maybe I could throw something out there and that so far nobody's listened when I've said this on your previous podcast, but maybe somebody will this time. um, I originally started. I wrote a pamphlet called The Potter's Wheel
Hmm.
like 15, 20 years ago, and I put it at Benchmark Books, and I told um, one of the employees, I'll remain nameless. I really like him; he's a good friend, but kind of messed this up for me. But I said, I'm putting this pamphlet out here. Um, if you could keep your ear to the ground when you're selling it to people, I want to know, is it worth writing the book? And he said, oh yeah, 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 yeah. I'll let you know. So about 3 months later, I came back and I think I sold one pamphlet and went to Fred Collier, who really liked it. And I said, so these aren't selling. What's your ear to the ground response? He said, oh, everybody's waiting for the book. And I was like, okay, you weren't supposed to tell them that, right? So the moral of the story is I'm curious what the market is for this specific volume, and any of the others really. Uh, I know there's certain people super excited about it because they write me and ask me to help stuff, which is really cool. But um, I don't want to spend 3 full-time weeks writing something and sell 3 copies and get
Hmm.
hate mail from everybody else. You know what I mean? Um, so, I really try and approach it of what was taught, not modern groups, what have modern groups taught, but what did the brethren teach and how is that different from modern groups teaching? That's really kind of the emphasis of the book. But I'm curious what the market is because some people tell me there's a huge market. Some people say there's none, that sort of stuff. But if any of the readers of any of the books and stuff I've talked about have specific interest or like really, I know a lot of people that are really interested in this. I would really appreciate knowing that in specific angles and stuff like that. Um, I, I've been writing some of these books literally over the past 10, 15 years on the side, just haven't finished. And when I'm looking at what order to produce them, it would really help to know, you know, how much are people really interested? Um, because some of these books, I honestly feel like I've got more important things to do, but
Hmm.
these are almost done, so I might as well get them done. And I know some people will enjoy them, but if it's only 15, I'd rather work on the book that makes 300 happy. And if it's only
Right.
300, I'd rather work on the book that makes 4,000 people happy. You know what I mean?
Right.
So anyway, so
Oh,
I'd be happy for any input if people wanted to pass that along and just email me directly.
absolutely. Absolutely.
So
If you watch us on YouTube or Spotify or any of the other platforms, just go ahead and leave a comment there. And then what I can do is I can get all those together and send them to Drew, and we can do a tally on those. And that way, Drew's given everybody kind of what they want, or the majority of people what they want. And look, I want to say one other thing here, and as we get closer to wrapping up, that was about it, right, Drew?
yeah, yeah, for sure.
As we're starting to wrap up here, I want to say this: we are not the church. And again, I'm not bad mouthing the church here. I'm just saying we are not the LDS church. We do not have dozens and dozens and dozens of scholars, right? Of guys who are producing works like yours doing. And that takes time and that takes money to produce the work that Drew is producing. And so buy his books. Look, donate, right? I mean, we need to start supporting each other here. Because I do think the days are coming where we're going to need our own stuff, which means
Yeah.
we have to support the people that are producing that stuff. And look, um, yeah, go buy his books, buy Drew's books. Get we're 6 months away from the holidays. If you're struggling on what to get your fundamentalist this holiday season, I recommend
The man who
anything from
has
the Briney
everything.
Library. So, um, yeah, anything at all. We gotta start supporting each other here in what we're doing, or else we're just not gonna survive. We're gonna need our own stuff sooner than later, and we got to start getting ready to keep that money closer to home, so to speak, and support those guys who are doing the work. But Drew, other than that, you're right. It was a varied conversation, but man, this might be one of my favorites we've had. I
Oh,
felt like we were just all over the place, and I really kind of dig
right,
that.
yeah. That made it a little bit more fun.
Yep. So, all right, man. Well, when you get closer to having that DNC one done, you or any of the other ones you want to discuss, you let me know, and we'll jump right back on here, and we'll break it down. And
Oh, for sure. It's super fun.
especially DNC 132. I think that's going to be awesome. So I'm looking forward to that.
All right. So that's your vote. That's the one to hit next.
That's the one I'm aiming for. I am saying absolutely DNC 132. That's Dave's vote for whatever it's worth.
Yeah.
I'm just one vote. So,
That's
but
that's that's the one I lean most towards because of commitments that I've made. I've also struggled a little bit more extra with that one.
yeah, I
It's
bet
yeah,
a little meaty in there. I mean,
yeah, yeah. Well, my tendency is to want to be thorough, and if it doesn't fit my series, I want to throw the footnote in, but then I have to say, it just that just
right.
doesn't fit what I'm doing, you know? But dang, it's hard not to do
Oh,
that.
totally.
Anyway,
100%. Yep. All right. Well, Drew, hang out for just 5 minutes. All right.
yeah, we'll do. Take care,
All right.
everybody. God bless.
Bye, everybody.